Before the night was over, Bram Dillard would say out loud what everyone in Dry Creek had been thinking for years. He stood at the center of the Red Willow Frost social, a glass in one thick hand, and he laughed that loose, careless laugh of a man who had never once worried about being wrong, and he looked straight at Wade Hollister and said it like it was a compliment. "Smart move, son. Poor Cowboy don't need a pretty wife. He needs one that works hard, don't ask for much, and is grateful enough to stay." Half the room laughed with him. The other half went very quiet. And Hester Bellamy, standing at the edge of the crowd with a serving tray still warm in her hands, felt something inside her chest go completely still, not from shame, but from the sudden, terrible recognition that someone had finally said the thing she had been afraid was true all along. If you've ever been the one everyone took for granted, the one who kept everything running while everyone else took the credit, stay with me. Because this story is for you, and if this is your first time here, welcome. I'd love for you to subscribe and follow along. I share stories like this one every week, and I promise you, you don't want to miss what's coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Hester Bellamy had not been born the plain one. That was something that happened gradually, the way a piece of furniture gets pushed against a wall, not because anyone decided it belonged there, but because it was simply easier to move around it than to put it somewhere better. She was the oldest of 3 daughters at Dry Creek Ranch, which sat on a wide, wind-scoured stretch of land in the fictional county of Harrow Flats. Her father, Gerald Bellamy, was a decent man in the way that a fence post is decent, solid, upright, and completely unaware of how little shade it provides. Her mother, Norma, had opinions about everything except the things that mattered most. 45 minutes discussing the thread count of a tablecloth, and never once noticed that her eldest daughter had been awake since before sunrise doing the work of 2 men. Hester's younger sisters were Clara and June. Clara had Norma's coloring fair skin, light eyes, hair that caught the sun and kept it. June had their father's easy confidence, the kind that made people lean toward her when she talked. Both of them, from the time they were old enough to notice, understood that the world responded to them differently. They didn't say it out loud. They didn't have to. It was just there, in the way their mother bought Clara a new dress before the fall dance and told Hester that her old blue one still looked fine. Hester's old blue one had a mended seam at the right shoulder and a hem she'd let down twice. She wore it anyway. She always did. By the time Hester turned 23, she had stopped expecting things to change. That wasn't bitterness, not exactly. It was more like the feeling you get after you've reached for something on a high shelf too many times and finally decide to stop reaching. Not because you don't want the thing, but because the wanting starts to feel like its own kind of punishment. She kept the kitchen. She kept the garden. She kept the records of what was owed and what was paid and what needed doing before the first frost. She salted the meat and mended the harnesses and stayed up past midnight when the old mare was sick and nobody else wanted to lose sleep over it. Her father called her dependable. Her mother called her sensible. The neighbors, when they bothered to call her anything at all, called her plain. Nobody asked what Hester called herself. She didn't think about it much. There wasn't time. Then the summer she turned 29, a man named Wade Hollister bought the struggling homestead beyond the Eastern Ridge, the one everyone in Harrow Flats said couldn't be turned around, that the soil was wrong and the well was unreliable, and whoever bought it was either desperate or foolish. The general opinion was that Wade Hollister was probably both. He showed up at the Bellamy place in late July looking to borrow a fence-stretching tool Gerald had mentioned having. He had sun-dark skin and quiet eyes, and the kind of hands that had clearly been working since, before they were fully grown. He didn't talk much. He said, "Thank you for the tool, and thank you for the water." Hester handed him from the pump because she happened to be there, not because anyone had asked her to offer it, and then he left. Hester didn't think about him afterward. Not much. Not right away. He brought the tool back 4 days later. Gerald wasn't home. Norma was in town with Clara. June was somewhere being June charming a horse or a neighbor boy, probably both. Hester was in the garden, on her knees, pulling volunteer tomatoes that had seeded themselves too close to the squash. She heard boots on the dry ground and looked up, and Wade Hollister was standing at the garden gate with the fence stretcher in one hand and his hat in the other. "Your father around?" he asked. "No. I can leave this by the barn." "That's fine." He didn't move right away. He looked at what she was doing, not in the way men sometimes looked at women working, assessing whether they were doing it correctly or commenting on it with their eyes. He just looked, the way you look at something that interests you. "You doing that by feel, or do you have a pattern figured out?" he asked. Hester sat back on her heels. "What do you mean?" "The spacing. Between the beds." He nodded at the garden layout. "It's not random. I've been trying to figure out how to set mine up, and I can't make the rows come out right." Hester looked at her garden the way she always did, like it was just a thing she maintained, not something worth remarking on. "You want the rows to follow the slope," she said finally. "Even a small one. Water runs downhill, and if you fight it all season." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing nobody told me. Most people figure it out after the first bad summer." "How many bad summers did it take you?" She almost smiled. "I was 9 when my father let me have my own patch." "So none." He nodded slowly, like that meant something to him. Then he put his hat back on and said he'd leave the tool by the barn. He was halfway across the yard when he stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he turned. "Miss Bellamy," he said, and the way he said it was careful. Not formal exactly. More like he'd considered her name before he used it. "Would you be willing to come to supper?" "At my place." "Friday, if the evening suits you." Hester stared at him. Not because the question surprised her, it did, but because of the word he'd used. Willing, not able, not available, not free, willing. Like whether she wanted to come was the relevant question. "Just supper," he added. "I won't pretend I cook well." "But I'd like the company." Hester was 30 years old that fall. In those 30 years, 3 men had shown interest in her, and all 3 had eventually drifted toward Clara or June, or some other girl in the county who was easier to look at and harder to overlook. One of them had told her, kindly, that she was the most capable woman he'd ever met, and she had understood even then that capable was what you said when you meant something else. She looked at Wade Hollister standing in her father's yard with his hat properly on and his question still hanging in the air between them. "Friday's fine," she said. She did not think about it for the rest of the week. That was a lie. She thought about it constantly. In the way you think about a cracked window in winter, aware of it every single moment, telling yourself it's not a big problem, knowing that it is. She didn't tell her mother. She knew what her mother would say, that it was kind of Wade to be charitable, that a man trying to get a struggling homestead on its feet probably needed connections in the county, that Hester ought to be helpful and not read more into it than was there. She didn't tell Clara. Clara would have meant well and said the wrong thing. Clara always meant well and said the wrong thing. She told June on Thursday evening, sitting on the porch after supper when the heat had finally dropped to something bearable. She said it the way you drop something fragile quickly, before you can think better of it. June turned and looked at her. Really looked. "He asked you to supper," June said. "Yes, at his place." Yes, June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Just that. Good." It was the most useful thing anyone in Hester's family had said to her in a long time. She wore the blue dress. She thought about the other one, the dark gray her mother had bought years ago and forgotten about. Still wrapped in the trunk, but she went with the blue because at least it was familiar. And she didn't want to be someone she wasn't on a night when she was already nervous enough. She walked to Wade's place because she didn't want to ask to use the buggy and have to explain why. It took her 40 minutes across the ridge. Wade's cabin was unfinished. That was the first thing she noticed, not in a critical way, just as a fact. The porch railing was missing 2 boards. The window on the north side had been patched with a piece of canvas that had been there long enough to bleach out in the sun. He was standing in the doorway when she came up the path. He'd made an effort. She could see that. His shirt was clean. His hair was damp. He'd shaved recently enough that he'd nicked himself along the jaw, and there was a small dark line of dried blood there that he probably hadn't noticed. "You walked?" he said. "It's not far." He looked like he wanted to say something else but didn't. Inside, the cabin was spare. 2 chairs at a rough-cut table. 2 plates. A cast-iron skillet still on the stove. And on the table, in a jar that had probably held preserves a week before, someone had put flowers. Prairie flowers, wild ones, not cultivated, the kind that grew along the creek banks. Purple and yellow, and one stubborn stem of something orange she couldn't identify. She stood there and looked at those flowers for longer than she meant to. "Down wherever you want," Wade said from the stove. "Fair warning, the beans are probably too salty." I wasn't paying attention. "How salty?" Questionable. She sat down at the table and looked at the jar of wildflowers and tried to remember the last time someone had put something on a table because she was going to be sitting at it. She couldn't. The beans were in fact too salty. The biscuits were slightly crooked and slightly underdone in the center, not dangerously, just honestly. Wade ate his without apologizing for them, and that somehow made them easier to eat. They talked about the garden first, her layout, his soil problems, the well that gave him trouble in the dry months. Then they talked about the county, the people she knew that he was still figuring out, the ones worth trusting and the ones worth watching. He listened when she talked, not in the polite way of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but like what she was saying was actually useful to him. At some point the sun finished going down, and the inside of the cabin got dark enough that Wade lit the lantern, and neither of them moved to leave. She told him about the garden, the real version, not the practical one. That she'd started it when she was 9, because her father gave her a patch of ground and told her she could do what she liked with it, and that it was the only thing in her life that had ever been entirely her decision. Wade nodded slowly. "What do you grow in it that isn't practical?" She looked at him. "What? In your part of the garden? Part that started as yours. What do you grow that nobody eats?" She hadn't expected that question. Nobody had ever asked her that question. "Flowers," she said, "some years when I have the space." "What kind?" "Whatever comes up. I save seeds from the ones I like and try them again the next year. Some of them don't take. The ones that do," she stopped. "It's not practical. I didn't ask if it was practical." She looked across the table at this man, with the nicked jaw and the 2 salty beans and the jar of wildflowers he'd put out because she was coming to supper. "Zinnias," she said mostly, "and sweet peas when the soil cooperates." He nodded, like that was exactly the right answer. Walking home in the dark across the ridge, Hester told herself very firmly not to make anything of it. It was one supper. He was new to the county and didn't know many people, and she was a neighbor, and it was nothing more than that. She believed that for about as long as it took her to get inside and hang up her coat. Then she sat down at the kitchen table in the dark and thought about those wildflowers in a preserve jar, and the way he'd asked her what she grew that wasn't practical, and how, in 30 years, no one had ever thought to wonder. And she was frightened, not of Wade Hollister specifically, but of the thing that had started happening somewhere between the garden gate and that table. The feeling of being seen. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd gotten used to going without it. And now she was terrified of how badly she wanted it, and more terrified still of what it would cost her when it turned out, as it always did, that she had misread the situation entirely. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. Over the following weeks, Wade kept finding reasons to come by the Bellamy place. Not every day. Not in a way that anyone would have called persistent. But regular enough that Hester started to notice when he hadn't been by, which was its own kind of information. He always spoke to her father if Gerald was around. He was respectful about that. He wasn't sly about it, wasn't sneaking anything past anyone. But the conversations he actually wanted to have were with Hester, And after a while, even Gerald's started directing him toward whatever corner of the property she happened to be working in. He remembered small things, that she took her coffee without sugar, that she preferred the pale biscuits to the ones that got dark on the bottom, that she had once said, in passing, that she found the smell of sage in August to be the one thing about late summer she actually liked, and the next time he came to the Bellamy place, he'd brought a bundle of it tied with a piece of twine, left on the porch rail without ceremony or explanation. Clara saw it and thought it was for their mother. June saw it and looked at Hester with an expression that said everything she didn't say out loud. The thing was, and this was what made Hester's chest tighten every time she let herself think about it, Wade never made her feel like a project. Some men, when they were kind to a woman everyone else had overlooked, did it with that faint air of rescue. Like they wanted you to know they were a certain kind of person. Like your gratitude was part of what they were after. Wade didn't do that. He just showed up, said what he meant. Asked questions he actually wanted answers to, and when she gave him those answers, he treated them like they mattered. Which was the most dangerous thing of all, because Hester Bellamy had spent 30 years being sensible about herself. She knew what she was and what she wasn't. She knew that Clara turned heads at the spring social and that June could make a whole room laugh and that Hester was the one who made sure everyone got home safe and the leftover food was stored properly. She had made her peace with being the kind of woman people were grateful for rather than drawn to. And now Wade Hollister was coming by twice a week and leaving bundles of sage on the porch rail and asking her about zinnias. And her carefully arranged piece was starting to look less like acceptance and more like a story she'd told herself for. So long she'd forgotten it wasn't necessarily true. One evening in early September, there was a harvest gathering at the Kendrick place, not a formal dance, more of a loose supper with fiddle music that tended to go late. Everyone from 3 counties came. It was the kind of event where the women set up the food tables and the men stood around discussing the season's yields, and the children ran underfoot until they fell asleep in corners. Hester, as usual, helped set up. She carried platters and arranged dishes and kept track of which serving spoons belonged to which neighbor's bowl, so nothing got lost at the end of the night. Her mother was in the thick of the socializing. Clara had already been asked to dance twice before the music was properly underway. June was holding court near the cider barrel with 3 separate young men who all seemed to believe they were the one she'd remember. At some point, Norma found Hester and said, "The way she always said things that were really instructions, Hester. We're running low on the pickled vegetables. I think I saw them put an extra crock in the cellar. Would you be a dear?" Hester went. The cellar was off the back of the Kendrick barn down a short flight of wooden steps and through a heavy door that smelled of earth and brine and old wood. She found the crock without trouble. She lifted it and turned around. Wade was at the top of the steps. He looked at her, not startled, not apologetic. Like he'd specifically come to find her. "How did you know where I went?" she asked. "I watched you leave," he said simply. Something shifted in Hester's chest. Not dramatically, just shifted, the way a door does when the latch gives. "I have to bring this up," she said. "I know." He didn't move. "I wanted to ask you something first." She waited. "They're playing a reel inside," Wade said. She looked at him. "Yes, I'd like to dance with you." She almost laughed, not cruelly, but from the surprise of it. "I'm holding a crock of pickled vegetables," I noticed. He came down 2 steps and held out his hand for the crock. "I'll carry that. Then I'd like to dance with you." Wade, she heard herself saying his name and registered dimly that it was the first time she had. "My mother sent me for those vegetables. People are waiting. They can wait 3 more minutes." She looked at him. He looked back at her, completely calm, completely serious. There was music coming from inside, faint through the walls of the barn, fiddle bright and familiar. "There's no room down here," she said. He looked around the small space, the crock shelves, the hard-packed dirt floor, the low ceiling. Then he reached out and took the crock from her hands, set it on the nearest shelf, and held out his hand. "There's room," he said. They danced between the root vegetable crates in the Kendrick cellar, with the fiddle music barely audible through two walls. And Wade did not step on her feet, and he did not hold her awkwardly at arm's length, the way men sometimes held women they weren't sure what to do with. He held her like she was someone he'd been looking forward to dancing with. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Then she took the crock, walked back up the steps, and carried it into the Kendrick kitchen. Nobody had noticed she was gone longer than expected. That was fine, she noticed, and standing there in the noise and warmth of the gathering, surrounded by people who needed the serving spoons pointed in the right direction, Hester allowed herself just for one moment to feel what it was like to be someone a man had come looking for. Then she put the feeling away firmly, like a letter you're not ready to answer yet. She had learned over 30 years not to let hope get ahead of what she actually knew. But that night in the cellar, those 3 or 4 minutes in the dark with fiddle music coming through the walls stayed with her. It stayed with her for a long time. She put the feeling away the way you put away something you're not sure you're allowed to have. That was what Hester told herself, walking home from the Kendrick gathering with the night air cold on her face and the sound of the fiddle finally gone quiet behind her. She told herself it was nothing, that a man who danced with you in a cellar for 3 minutes while the pickled vegetables waited on a shelf was not necessarily a man who meant anything by it. That she was 30 years old, and she knew better than to reconstruct an entire future out of a bundle of sage and a jar of wildflowers and one honest question about zinnias. She was very reasonable about it. She was also completely unable to sleep. She lay in her narrow bed in the room she had shared with Clara until Clara was 16 and complained enough that their parents rearranged things. And she stared at the ceiling, and she thought about the way Wade had said, "I watched you leave," not as something to flatter her, just as a plain statement of fact. Like it was the most natural thing to explain why he'd followed her down into a root cellar in the middle of a harvest gathering. Like watching where she went was simply something he did. Nobody watched where Hester went. Nobody had ever needed to, because she always came back. She always finished the job. She always brought the crock upstairs and pointed the serving spoons in the right direction and stayed until the end to help clean up. There was no reason to track her. She was reliable. She was the human equivalent of the barn, always where you left her, always doing what she was built for. The thought should not have made her angry. She had never been angry about it before. She realized in the dark, a little angry about it now. Not at anyone in particular, just at the fact of it. The long accumulated fact of being the one everyone trusted to stay, while never once stopping to wonder whether staying was what she actually wanted. She turned over and told herself to go to sleep. She didn't go to sleep. In the morning, she got up before anyone else, the way she always did, and started the fire and started the coffee. And by the time her mother came downstairs in her housecoat, Hester had already been awake for an hour and a half and had made her peace again with what she was and wasn't, except that Wade came by 2 days later, not to see her father. Gerald was in the east field, and Wade knew it, because he'd passed him on the road in. He came to the garden gate, the same place he'd first stopped, and he waited there until Hester looked up. "I have a question about the south bed," he said. She sat back on her heels. "You don't have a south bed yet. I'm planning one." "What's the question?" "I don't know yet. I thought it might come to me if I saw yours." Hester looked at him. He looked back at her. He was not smiling exactly, but there was something in the set of his expression that was close enough to it. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees, and opened the gate. She showed him the south bed the way she'd amended the soil over 3 seasons, the drainage she'd built in by hand after the second wet spring flooded it, the particular angle of the fence that gave it afternoon shade without blocking the morning light. She talked about it the way she always talked about the garden, practically, with specific details, without embellishment. And Wade listened and asked the kind of questions that showed he was actually thinking about what she said, not just waiting to be done listening. At the end of it, he crouched down and looked at the soil in the way men examined things they were genuinely curious about. "You did all this yourself," he said. It was not a question. "Time," she said. "When did you start the amendment?" 3 years ago. Before that, it was too clay-heavy to drain properly." He looked up at her. "Did you know when you started that it would take 3 years?" She thought about it. "I knew it would take time." "That's a lot of faith to put into dirt." "It's not faith," she said. "It's you look at what's there, and you figure out what it needs, and you do that consistently, and eventually the ground changes." "Just work." He stood up slowly, still looking at the bed. "I think maybe that's what faith looks like when you're actually good at something." Hester didn't answer that. She wasn't sure how to. He left 20 minutes later. He said thank you, the way he always said thank you, like he meant it and wasn't performing it. And he was halfway down the road before she realized she was still standing at the garden gate watching him go, which was not something she had planned to do. She went back inside and didn't mention to her mother that Wade had come by. Norma found out anyway. She found out from the neighbor woman, Mrs. Alcott, who had the kind of eyesight that operated best when aimed at other people's business. Mrs. Alcott had seen Wade's horse at the Bellamy fence for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and she had drawn the appropriate conclusions and shared them at the Thursday afternoon sewing circle with the careful tone of someone performing a public service. Norma came home from that sewing circle with a specific kind of brightness in her eyes that Hester recognized and immediately felt tired by. "I hear Wade Hollister has been coming around." Her mother said, at supper, not quite casually enough. Gerald looked up from his plate. Hester cut a piece of potato. "He had some questions about the garden layout. 3 times in 2 weeks seems like a lot of questions about a garden layout. He's starting from scratch. It's a complicated process." Clara looked between them with the alert expression of someone hoping for an interesting development. June was watching Hester with her quiet, observant eyes and not saying anything. "He's a hard-working young man," Norma said. "Everyone says so. The Hendersons helped him put up his east fence last month, and they said he didn't stop from sunup to sundown. Of course, his land is." She made a small sound that conveyed a significant amount without technically saying anything critical. "Well, it's a challenge." "It's workable," Hester said. "You've seen it?" She had made an error. She saw that immediately, in the way her mother's eyebrows moved a fraction of an inch upward. "He's mentioned it," Hester said. Norma took a sip of her water. "Well, it would take a very particular kind of woman to make something of a place like that." Nobody said anything. "The practical kind," Norma continued pleasantly. "Someone who didn't mind hard work, who knew how to stretch what little there was." She smiled at Hester across the table. "That's a compliment, of course." Hester looked at her mother's smile. She looked at it for a moment longer than was probably comfortable. Then she said, evenly, "I'm sure it is," and she went back to her potato. But something had shifted in her, something small and sharp, like a splinter working its way to the surface. Because her mother hadn't said anything, Hester hadn't thought herself hadn't thought, in the lonelier hours, with the particular cruelty of a mind that turns against itself at 2 in the morning. She had thought it in exactly those terms, that a man with Wade's challenges and Wade's resources would look at Hester Bellamy and do the math the same way everyone else did, that what she offered was practical value, that she was in the end a logical choice rather than a preferred one. The fact that her mother said it with kindness made it worse somehow. Not better. She said nothing more about it that night. She cleared the table and washed the dishes and went to bed early, which she blamed on a headache. June came and stood in the doorway of her room at 9 o'clock and leaned against the frame with her arms crossed. "Mama means well," June said. "I know she does. That doesn't mean she isn't wrong." Hester looked at the ceiling. "She's not saying anything I haven't said to myself." "I know, that's what I'm talking about." June was quiet for a moment. "Wade Hollister doesn't look at you the way a man looks at something useful." "You don't know how he looks at me." "I've got eyes, Hester." "You've seen him twice." "I've seen you when he's around." June said. Different. She pushed off the doorframe. Get some sleep. You look terrible. That was June's version of comfort. It was, in its own way, more effective than anything gentler would have been. Hester closed her eyes. She thought about the dance in the Kendrick cellar, Wade's hand at her waist, steady and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and no particular need to impress anyone with how he held her. Thought about the way he'd asked what she grew that wasn't practical. She thought about the jar of wildflowers, and then, with the careful discipline of a woman who had managed difficult things her entire life, she thought about what it would feel like to let herself believe it and be wrong. That was the one she kept coming back to, not the hope. The aftermath of hoping. She had managed everything in her life through good sense and clear eyes. She had taken things as they were. She had not invented reasons to expect more than what she was given. That was how she had stayed intact, not happy, not exactly, but intact. Functional, not broken. If she let herself believe that Wade Hollister came by for her and not for the garden advice, and she was wrong, she would lose something she'd been very careful never to put at risk. She would lose the version of herself that was fine. That was what kept her from letting herself simply feel what she felt. Not fear of rejection exactly, fear of the afterward. The going back to the way things were once you'd made the mistake of hoping they might be different. She was very nearly asleep when she heard, very faintly, the sound she'd been turning over in her mind for days. I watched you leave. She pressed her face into the pillow. She was in significant trouble, and she knew it. 3 weeks passed with the slow, taut quality of wire. Being stretched, nothing broke, but the tension was there in every quiet moment. Wade continued to come by. Hester continued to speak to him about practical things, while carefully not looking at him for too long. June continued to say nothing and see everything. Clara began to suspect something was happening, but couldn't quite locate what, and asked Hester twice if she was feeling well, which Hester answered both times with yes. I'm fine, in the voice she used when she meant to be believed. The first real break in the surface came on a Thursday morning in October when Hester's mother came home from another sewing circle. The woman had a social infrastructure that would have impressed a general with news that she delivered, as idle conversation over the bread she was slicing. I heard that Bram Dillard has been asking about Wade Hollister, Norma said. Hester was measuring out flour and did not look up. What about him? Just general questions. What kind of man he is. Whether his land could be worth anything in 10 years. Norma set down the bread knife. Bram Dillard doesn't ask questions without a reason. Hester was aware of Bram Dillard in the way that everyone in Harrow Flats was aware of him as a fixture, an inevitability, a man who had so much land and so much money that he had long ago stopped distinguishing between opinions and facts. He was not cruel, exactly. He was just enormously certain about everything, which produced a similar effect. He had 4,000 acres to the north, and a habit of buying up homesteads when the owners got discouraged enough to sell cheap. He was not a villain in any storybook sense. He was simply the gravity of the county. Everything small eventually moved in his direction. What does Bram Dillard care about Wade Hollister's land? Hester asked. That's what I'd want to know, her mother said pleasantly. And then she went back to slicing bread as if the matter were closed. Closed. 2 days later, at the dry goods store in town, Hester was waiting for the clerk to fill her order when she heard Bram Dillard's voice behind her, aimed at someone she couldn't immediately see. Stubborn thing to attempt, that parcel. I've had my eye on it for 15 years. Wrong soil, wrong water table, wrong everything. Man'd have to be either very skilled or very lucky to make it work. Or both, said the other voice, and Hester recognized it as Wade. She did not turn around. Hard to be both, Bram said. He had the voice of a man who believed his observations were gifts. Usually the ones that are really skilled know better than to try. Which leaves well. A pause that was somehow louder than words. You know what it leaves. A beat of silence. I expect I'll figure it out, Wade said. I expect you'll try. And in Bram's tone, there was something that was almost warmth, which was worse than contempt would have been. Good luck to you, son. Genuinely. I just hope you know what you're getting into on all fronts. There was a particular weight on the phrase all fronts that Hester understood, even though she wasn't sure she was supposed to. She picked up her basket from the counter and left without waiting for the clerk to finish. And she told herself she was simply in a hurry, and it had nothing to do with not wanting to turn around. She was almost to the door when she heard her name. Not Bram's voice, Wade's. She stopped. She turned. He was standing near the hardware section with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a look on his face that was harder to read than usual. Bram Dillard had already moved on to another conversation across the store, the way a large fish resumes its circuit of a pond after nosing something on the surface. I didn't know you were in town today, Wade said. I didn't know you were, she said. A small pause. You didn't stay, he said, at the counter. I had what I needed. He looked at her for a moment, just long enough that she felt it, but not long enough that she could call it anything. I'd like to come by Saturday, he said, if that's all right. She should have said she'd check with her father. She should have said she wasn't sure what Saturday looked like. She should have said any number of reasonable, self-protective things that would have bought her a little more time to get her ground back under her. Saturday's fine, she said. He nodded. He didn't smile. But something in the line of his jaw eased slightly, which was, she was beginning to understand, Wade's equivalent of a smile. She walked to the wagon and held the reins correctly and didn't let herself feel anything else about it until she was back out on the open road and there was no one to see her. Then she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something she could not quite name, not happiness, too frightened to be happiness, but adjacent to it. The way a window cracked open lets in air that isn't quite warm yet, but carries the suggestion of warmth. 30 seconds. Then she put it away. She told herself, being extremely sensible. Saturday arrived the way important days do when you've been both dreading and anticipating them too quickly, and after a week that felt like it moved through mud. Hester woke up earlier than usual and then lay there being annoyed at herself for waking up early, which did not improve the morning. Wade arrived mid-morning when the October light was at that particular low, sharp angle that made everything look like it was being painted from the wrong direction. He came around to the garden rather than to the front, which meant he either knew she'd be there or he'd stopped at the house first and been told. Either way, she was there, doing the last of the fall clearing, and he stood at the gate the same way he had the first time. She had thought privately that she would feel more composed by now, that whatever this was would have settled into something she could manage. Instead, she felt exactly as unsteady as she had that first Friday when she'd walked 40 minutes over the ridge for 2 salty beans and a jar of wildflowers. I want to tell you something, he said without preamble. She stood up straight and waited. I heard what Bram Dillard said. In the store, he looked at her steadily, not what he said to me. What he said before that, about the land, she said nothing. The bit about all fronts. She felt her face go very careful and still, the way it did when she was keeping something back. I don't want you to have heard that and thought. He stopped. He looked off to the side for a moment, the way men did when they were reaching for words they didn't use often. This isn't about what's practical, Hester. Coming here, asking to see you. That's not what this is. She looked at him. I know that's what people think, he said. Man with a hard patch of land, woman who knows how to work one, and it all lines up too conveniently. I know that's how it looks. Does it matter how it looks? Her voice was steadier than she felt. It matters what you think. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dried stalks of the garden and made a sound like paper. I don't know what I think, she said finally, which was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in a long time. He nodded, like that was a fair answer, like he wasn't going to push past it. All right, he said. They stood there for a moment in the October light, not quite at ease and not in conflict either, just 2 people being honest about where they were. There's something I want to ask you, Hester said. She didn't know she was going to say it until it was out. He waited. When you came to the harvest gathering. And you followed me to the cellar, she watched his face. Why did you do that? He thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking. Because you'd been moving food and minding other people's business all evening, he said. And then you disappeared into a back room, and nobody at the whole table even turned around to see where you went. And that exhaled. That bothered me, more than I expected it to. She looked at him. You were looking for her, she said quietly. Not quite a question. I was looking for you, he said. That's the part I want you to understand. The wind came through the garden again. One of the last stubborn zinnias she hadn't pulled yet deep red, past its prime, petals going papery at the edges moved on its stem. Hester looked at it, then she looked back at Wade. And she did not put the feeling away. Not this time. She let it stay, the frightening, exposed, open feeling of being looked for by someone who wasn't counting what you were worth to them. She let it sit in her chest the way cold air sits when you first breathe it, sharp and real, and impossible to pretend isn't there. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she needed to. Wade looked at the garden. He looked at the last red zinnia. Then he looked at her in the careful, direct way he had, not performing, not angling for anything. I'll come by again, he said, if you're willing. There was that word again, willing. Yes, she said. He nodded, picked up the gate latch, and left. Hester stood in the cold garden, with the wind moving through everything and the dried stalks making their paper sound, and she thought, this is the part where I usually make it smaller than it is. This is the part where I take the thing that just happened and I reduce it to a reasonable size that I can carry without spilling. She thought about doing that. She decided for once not to. She left the zinnia where it was, didn't pull it. Let it stand there going papery in the October cold for another 2 weeks until the first hard freeze took it. That was the first time she could remember making a choice entirely because she wanted to, with no practical justification for it at all. It felt strange. It felt underneath the strange, like something she might learn to do again. What she didn't know, standing in that garden with the cold light falling sideways through the dead stalks, was that other people had been watching the same thing she was living through and drawing their own conclusions, for their own reasons in ways she had no way yet to anticipate. Bram Dillard was not a man who forgot a conversation, and the thing he'd said in the dry goods store about all fronts had not been careless. He had meant for Wade to hear it, and he had very possibly meant for Hester to hear it too. Not out of cruelty exactly. Out of the particular certainty of a man who believed he was simply reading the situation correctly, that Wade Hollister was a practical young man making a practical decision, and that there was no reason to pretend otherwise. Bram Dillard had never, in 62 years of living, looked at Hester Bellamy and seen someone a man might choose. He had looked at her and seen very clearly something else. And the thing about men like Bram was not that they were wrong about everything. It was that they were right about enough that they never learned to doubt themselves when they were wrong. That was the thing that was coming. Hester didn't know it yet. She was still standing in the garden. The winter was still 6 weeks away. But somewhere across Harrow Flats, the Red Willow Frost Social was already being planned, the biggest gathering of the year. The kind that brought out every family within 20 miles, and Bram Dillard had already been asked to give the welcome remarks, which he always enjoyed, because he was a man who liked to say what he thought. And what he thought about Wade Hollister and Hester Bellamy he had not yet finished saying. November came in hard that year. The cold arrived 2 weeks early and hit the county like a hand laid, flat, sudden, final, no room to negotiate. The Bellamy Ranch buttoned itself down the way ranches do. Storm windows, banked fires, the long interior work of a household preparing to wait out something larger than itself. Hester worked. She always worked. But something had changed in the texture of it, not the work itself, but the way she moved through it. She noticed herself noticing things, the way the kitchen smelled different in the cold. The particular blue of the sky in November which was not like the blue of summer at all. The weight of her hands when she was tired, which she had never paid attention to before, because paying attention to tiredness seemed like something you did when you could afford to stop. She couldn't explain the change exactly. It was as though something that had been compressed for a long time had been given a very small amount of room and was moving cautiously into that room, unsure if it was allowed to be there. Wade came on Saturdays when the weather permitted. When it didn't, he sent word by whoever was heading in that direction. Once it was old Jim Peabody from the next ridge who delivered firewood and carried a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket with the words, "Weather's held me up Saturday next if you're willing, W." H scratched on it in handwriting that was functional rather than elegant. Hester unfolded that paper in the kitchen while her mother was in the other room. She folded it back up and put it in her apron pocket and carried it there for the rest of the day. On the Saturdays he did come, they had developed, without discussing it, a loose pattern. He would come to the garden gate or the kitchen door, depending on the season. She would offer coffee, which he always took. They would sit at the kitchen table or, if the weather allowed, outside, and they would talk. Not about anything in particular, about the land and the season and the news from the county. About things that had happened and things they remembered. About small specific details of their days that had no particular significance except that they found themselves wanting to share them. Clara observed this with open fascination. She had decided, in the way Clara decided things, that it was romantic. And she was not wrong about that, but she was wrong about what kind of romantic it was. She expected something dramatic, something with more visible feeling in it, and when she didn't see that, she sometimes looked confused, like she was watching a play in a language she mostly understood. June observed it differently. June watched the particular quality of Hester's silence when Wade left, not the ordinary silence Hester always had, but a specific, textured quiet that was new, and she kept what she observed to herself, because June had always understood that some things got damaged by being talked about too soon. Their mother observed it with the benevolent approval of a woman who had decided this was a good practical development and was occasionally accidentally unkind about it in exactly the way she had been unkind at supper. She meant well. Hester had stopped doubting that her mother meant well. What she had started to doubt was whether meaning well was as useful as people assumed. Her father said almost nothing. Gerald Bellamy had been saying almost nothing about Hester's interior life for 30 years, which was a habit too deep to break easily. But once in early November, when Wade had just left and Hester was clearing the coffee cups, Gerald said from behind his newspaper, without looking up, "He's steady." Hester looked at the back of the newspaper. "Yes," she said. Gerald turned a page. "That counts for something." "It does," she agreed. The newspaper stayed up. That was the end of the conversation. But it sat with her differently than her mother's observations. Did not because her father had said more, but because he had, for once, said something that wasn't about what Hester could do or how she might be useful. He had said something about Wade, about what Wade was, which was different. She thought about that on and off for the rest of the week. The Red Willow Frost Social was set for the third Friday in November. It was an annual event that the county took seriously, serious enough that people started discussing what they would wear in October and what dish they would bring in early November, and who would be there and what might happen among the who. It was held in the old Weston barn, which was large enough to fit half the county and warm enough, once you packed that many bodies in, to forget that winter had come. Hester had attended every Frost social since she was 7 years old. She had enjoyed some of them. She had worked at all of them because someone always had to manage the food tables and organize the serving and keep track of whose platter was whose, and that someone was reliably Hester. She didn't mind, usually. This year, for the first time, she minded a little. Not enough to say so, not enough to do anything about it. Just a small new awareness that this was a pattern and that she had never been asked if the pattern suited her. Wade had mentioned the social in passing. In the careful way, he mentioned things that were really questions. "You'll be there," he'd said, not quite asking. "I'm always there," she'd said. He'd nodded slowly. "I'll be there too." A pause. "I'd like to find you." "I'll be at the food tables," she said, most of the evening. Something moved across his expression, not quite frustration, more like recognition. "I'll find you wherever you are," he said. She thought about that in the days leading up to the social. She thought about it more than she should have. She arranged it next to the other things he had said. "I watched you leave, I was looking for you," and she tried to look at the arrangement and not be swayed by it. She tried to be clear-eyed. She tried to take it as what it was rather than what she wanted it to be. She was not entirely successful. The night of the Frost social was clear and cold, the kind of that made the stars look close and the breath visible and the world outside the barn very dark against the warmth of the lanterns inside. Hester wore her gray wool dress, not the blue, which she had been unconsciously saving for something, though she could not have said what, and she arrived with her family and went immediately to the food tables because that was what she did. She arranged dishes. She ensured the serving utensils were where they needed to be. She accepted from Mrs. Kessler a massive bowl of her famous corn relish and found a place for it and listened to Mrs. Kessler explained for the 8th year in a row how to properly serve it. And she looked periodically toward the door. She told herself she was not doing this. She was doing this. Wade arrived 40 minutes in, with the cold still on his coat and his hat in his hand. He scanned the room in the way he did things systematically, without performance, and when he found her, he moved in her direction, without detour. There were people between them. He went around them. He came to the food table and stood on the other side of it. "You found me," she said. "I said I would." She handed him a plate without thinking about it, which was a deeply automatic gesture, and then felt faintly annoyed at herself for it. He took the plate. He did not, as she'd half-expected, move away to fill it and find someone to talk to. He stayed at the table. He stayed there, in fact, for the next hour and a half. Not eating, not talking to everyone who came by, not doing what people did at the food table, which was fill their plate and move on. He stood at the table and talked to Hester while she worked, and when there was nothing to say, they were quiet together, which was a different thing from silence. Other people noticed. She was aware of them noticing. Mrs. Alcott, who missed nothing, looked over 3 times. Clara kept glancing in their direction with barely contained delight. Bram Dillard, standing in the center of the room with his usual gravitational certainty, noticed too, she could tell by the way his gaze passed over them, and then came back once, weighing something. She did not think much about Bram Dillard in that moment. She was thinking about Wade, beside the food table, staying. At some point, Norma came over with the brightness in her eyes that meant she had opinions and had been waiting to deploy them. She greeted Wade with warmth. She complimented Hester on how well the tables had come together. A smile that was genuinely meant kindly. It's wonderful to see someone appreciating all the hard work Hester puts in. And Wade looked at Norma, and then he looked at Hester. And he said, quietly enough that not everyone heard, but Hester certainly did, "I'm not here for the table." Norma blinked. She smiled again. "Less." "Certainly, of course," she said, and drifted away toward another conversation. Hester stood there. She didn't look at him immediately. She adjusted the placement of the corn relish, which did not need adjusting. "You didn't have to say that," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "My mother means well, I know she does." A pause. "I meant it," he said. She picked up a spoon, set it back down. Looked at the table. "I know you did," she said. And that was the moment, not the dance in the cellar, not the wildflowers in the jar, not the note about Saturday in her apron pocket. That was the moment she felt the last careful layer of protection she'd built around herself go very thin. Not disappear. She was not someone things disappeared in cleanly. Thin, transparent, like a window someone had finally cleaned, so you could see through it again, which was wonderful, and also meant you were now aware of how fragile the glass was. The evening went on. It filled up with the ordinary business of a county gathering music and food and conversations and children underfoot. Hester managed the table. Wade stayed in her orbit. People danced. And then, near the end of the evening, with the crowd thinned to the people who always stayed latest, Bram Dillard raised his voice from the center of the room, not quite a speech, not quite an announcement, just a man saying what was on his mind in a room that happened to have people in it. He was saying something to the group around him, something that started as a comment about the year's yields and moved, the way Bram's conversations moved, by his own internal logic, towards something else. Hester heard her name. Then she heard Wade's. Then she heard Bram Dillard laugh that open. Careless laugh. The laugh of a man who had never in his life had to worry about what people thought of him, and she heard him say it clearly, in a voice that carried, to the people around him and also, unavoidably, to the room at large. Smart move, son. Poor Cowboy don't need a pretty wife. He needs one that works hard, don't ask for much, and is grateful enough to stay. Someone laughed. More than one someone. It moved through the thinned crowd the way a stone moves through shallow water, the ripple visible, the cause immediately obvious. Hester held a serving spoon. She did not move. The room did not go silent. That was the thing about moments like this. The room never went as silent as it felt like it should. Life kept going. The fire kept crackling. Someone's child said something at the edge of the room. The fiddle player at the far end, oblivious, drew his bow across a string. Hester looked at the corn relish. She had arranged this table. She had managed this event. She had spent this evening, as she spent every evening at every event in Harrow Flats, making sure everything ran correctly and nobody went without. And she had done it with such consistency and such silence that a man like Bram Dillard could stand in the middle of the room she had helped make comfortable and say what he had just said and receive laughter for it. She heard Wade's cup go down, not thrown, set, but with a particular deliberate care that was, if you knew him, louder than throwing would have been. And she heard very clearly his voice. What came next would mark a line in Hester Bellamy's life, the kind of line you don't see coming and can't uncross after you've passed it. On one side of it was the woman who put the feeling away. On the other side was the woman who had finally run out of room to put anything. She did not yet know which woman she was going to be. But she was holding a serving spoon in a room that had just laughed at the terms of her value, and she was done being quiet about it. The moment was already moving. She moved with it. The laughter was still moving through the room when Wade set his cup down. It was not a dramatic sound. That was the thing about it. He didn't slam it, didn't throw it, didn't make any of the gestures that would have announced itself as a response. He simply set the cup on the nearest flat surface with a quiet, deliberate care that was somehow worse than noise, would have been the sound of a man deciding something, not performing deciding it. Bram Dillard was still smiling. The people around him were still settling from the laugh, the way a pond settles after something breaks its surface. One of them, Harvey Crane, who ran the feed store and had the social awareness of a fence post, was still chuckling softly, shaking his head like he'd just heard something pleasantly true. Hester had not moved. She was standing behind the food table with a serving spoon in her hand and the corn relish bowl 6 inches to her left, and she had not moved because her body had not yet received the signal from the part of her brain that was still processing what had just happened. There was a delay. She was aware of it. She could feel the delay like a held breath. What Bram had said was not new. That was the worst part. The words themselves, poor Cowboy. Works hard. Don't ask for much. Grateful enough to stay those were not words she hadn't heard in some form before. She had heard them in her mother's voice at the supper table. She had heard them in her own voice at 2 a.m. when her mind turned against her. She had heard them in the careful silences of neighbors who looked at her and looked at Wade and drew their arithmetic without saying it out loud. But Bram Dillard had said it in a room full of people who laughed. That was different. That was the thing being named in public and applauded for its accuracy. And Hester felt it, The way you feel a word you've been trying, not to think the relief of it being out in the air, followed immediately by the horror that it's now out in the air. Wade moved. He walked across the room toward Bram Dillard with the same even, unhurried step he brought to everything not angry in the surface way, not red-faced, not performing anything for anyone. Just moving in one direction because he had decided to. The crowd between them shifted without being asked, the way crowds do when something is about to happen, and they're not sure yet whether to watch or look away. Bram saw him coming and did not look concerned. Bram Dillard had 62 years of being the largest presence in any room he entered, and he faced Wade's approach with the equanimity of a man who had never once been on the wrong side of a situation. "Wade," he said almost warmly. Mr. Dillard Wade stopped a reasonable distance away, close enough that the conversation would be audible to the people nearby. Not so close it was a physical threat. He had, Hester thought, from her place at the food table, calculated the exact distance required. "I want to be clear about something," Wade said. "By all means," Bram said. The room had gone genuinely quiet now, not the half-quiet of before the full quiet. Even Harvey Crane had stopped chuckling. If Hester Bellamy never cooked another meal in her life, Wade said, and never planted another row in a garden, and never mended another thing, and never did one useful task from this moment forward, he paused. Not for effect. He paused the way you pause when you're making sure the words are the right ones. I would still want her sitting across from me at supper every evening. That's why I come around. That's the whole of it. The room held its breath. Bram Dillard looked at him. Something moved across Bram's face, not embarrassment, not quite, because men like Bram did not easily embarrass. More like the expression of someone who has just heard an argument they hadn't anticipated and are in the process of deciding whether it counts. "That's a fine sentiment," Bram said after a moment. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Noble, even. "It's not a sentiment," Wade said. "It's just true." Another pause. Bram looked at him for a moment longer, then looked, and this was the thing that shifted something in the room. He looked toward Hester. Like she was the footnote to a conversation about her. Like he was checking his math, and that was when Hester moved. Not because she had planned to, not because she had thought it through or prepared what she was going to say or had any clear sense of what happened after. She moved because she had been standing still for 30 years, and the combined weight of this particular moment, the laughter, the serving spoon, Wade's voice saying her name in a room that had just laughed at what she was worth, had finally exceeded the weight of everything that had kept her from moving before. She came around the table. She walked across the room. People made room for her. That was strange. They always moved around Hester, accommodated her, stepped aside so she could get to the next task. But this was different. They moved the way people move, when they sense something is happening and they don't want to be in the way of it. She stopped beside Wade. Not behind him, not at a slight angle. Beside him. She looked at Bram Dillard. Bram Dillard looked back at her with the expression of a man who has not expected to have to deal with this particular variable. "I have spent my whole life," Hester said, and her voice was quieter than she'd expected it to be, which somehow made it carry better. "Being useful." She said it plainly, not as an accusation, as a statement. "I can manage a household, preserve 6 months of food, keep the records, fix a harness, tend a sick animal, and do it all without being asked twice. I know exactly what I'm worth in practical terms." She paused. "I also know that that's the only way people have ever thought to look at me." Bram started to say something. She kept going. "What you said was kind to you, Mr. Dillard. You weren't being cruel. You were just saying the obvious thing, the thing that everyone here has probably thought at some point." She looked around briefly at the room and the people in it, and she saw in their faces the particular discomfort of people who recognized themselves in something they wished had not been said out loud. "But I am done letting what I can do determine what I'm worth. And I am done letting other people decide what I should be grateful for." She looked back at Bram. "I'm proud of every callus on my hand," she said. I earned every one of them honestly, but my work is not my value. And I will not be discussed like a transaction in the middle of a room I helped set up. The silence was total. Even the fire seemed to take up less space. Bram Dillard looked at her for a long moment. And something in his expression shifted, not an apology, not yet, maybe not ever, but the specific look of a man who has just been made to see something he hadn't seen before and is not sure he's comfortable with the seeing. "Miss Bellamy," he said finally, in a voice that had lost its certainty around the edges. "I meant no offense, I know," she said. "That's almost the point." She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned. She was not quite sure what to do with herself after that. Her heart was going very fast, and her hands were not entirely steady, and she was aware, acutely, of every pair of eyes in the room, and the profound silence that was still sitting over everything like a hand laid flat. She walked back to the food table. She did not know what else to do. The food table was where she had always been. It was the one fixed point she was certain of. She got behind it, and she put the serving spoon back in the relish bowl, and she stood there, and she breathed. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then June, from somewhere to the left, said just loudly enough, "Well." And that broke the surface enough for the room to slowly, cautiously begin to breathe again. Conversations restarted in low registers. The fiddle player made a tentative inquiry at his strings. Harvey Crane, to his credit, looked at the floor. Bram Dillard said something to the man beside him quietly, and the men around him absorbed this, and the cluster dispersed in the way clusters do when the moment that gathered them is over. Wade came to stand beside the food table, not across from it. Beside it, on her side, he didn't say anything. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the corn relish. She looked at the platter of cold meats that needed rearranging. She looked at the practical inventory of a table she had set up and would take down, and had always, as long as she could remember, been responsible for. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. That was he paused. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I know you did." She moved the cold meat platter a quarter inch to the left. "But you were saying it for me. I needed to say it for myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Just that." She finally looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or rather, she had seen the components of it separately, the steadiness, the attention, the lack of performance. But together, here, in the aftermath of what had just happened, it looked different. It looked like something that had been building for a while and was now simply visible. "I think," she said carefully, "I need some air. I'll come with you." She almost said no. The reflex was immediate, and the reflex that said, "Don't take up too much. Don't need too much. Don't let someone put themselves out on your account." She let it pass. "All right," she said. Outside, the night was deeply cold. Kind of cold that made you immediately certain of your own edges where you ended and the air began. The stars were as close as they'd looked coming in. The barn door shut behind them, and the noise of the gathering became muffled and distant, like sound through water. They stood on the rough board step and breathed the cold air. "Shaking," he said. "I'm aware." He took off his coat without asking and put it around her shoulders. The coat was too large and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular outdoor smell she had come to associate specifically with him. She pulled it closer. "I've never done that before," she said. "I know." Said something like that in front of people. "I know." She looked at the dark field beyond the barn. The frozen grass, the distant line of the tree break to the north, black against the slightly lighter sky. "It frightened me more than I thought it would," she said. "Most important things do." She glanced at him. He was looking at the same field. His jaw was tight against the cold he had no coat on, which she was now aware of. "You're going to freeze," she said. "Probably. That's not smart." "I'm aware." A small sound came out of her, not quite a laugh. Close enough. They stood there in the cold and the quiet, and Hester felt the shaking in her hands slowly start to ease, not from warmth. The coat wasn't quite enough for that, but from something else. From the solid, unhurried presence of a man standing next to her in the dark without needing anything from her at all. That was the thing she kept discovering about Wade and being surprised by each time. He didn't need her to manage anything. He didn't need her to be useful or sensible or productive. He seemed to need, specifically and only, her company, which was the one thing she had never in her life been asked to simply provide without doing something else alongside it. Wade, she said, yes. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. What you said in there, she said. About supper, about wanting me sitting across from you. He waited. I need to know if you meant it. He looked at her for a moment with those quiet, direct eyes. I said it in front of 50 people, he said. I don't usually say things I don't mean in front of 50 people. I know. She stopped. She was trying to find the right words, and the cold was making her mind slow. I need to know that you're not looking at me and seeing a solution. A solution to what? To your land, to your situation, to the practical problem of needing a partner who can carry the weight of a struggling homestead. He was quiet for long enough that she felt her chest start to tighten. I won't tell you I didn't notice, he said finally. That you're capable, that you understand land and work and what it takes. I noticed that from the first day. He paused. But here's the thing. I could have gone to 3 different women in this county and found those same qualities. Martha Henderson works as hard as any man. Ida Crane knows more about soil than most farmers. He looked at her steadily. I didn't go to Martha Henderson's garden gate. I went to yours. She looked at him. I came to your gate because of what you said about fighting the slope of the land, he said. And then I kept coming back because of everything else. The way you think, the way you talk about the things that matter to you, the way you are when nobody's looking at you, he exhaled slowly. I'm not looking for a solution, Hester. I'm looking at you. There's a difference. The cold wrapped around both of them, and the barn behind them hummed with the noise of 50 people, and the fiddle had started up again, some fast-moving reel that bled through the walls in bright, broken pieces. Hester stood in the middle of all of it and felt, for the second time in her life, the specific exposure of being seen completely. The first time had frightened her so much she'd almost run from it. This time she held still. All right, she said quietly. He nodded. All right. They stood there another minute. Then she took off his coat and held it back out to him. Put this on before you lose a finger, she said. He took it. He was almost smiling. We should go back in. Yes. You don't have to manage the table for the rest of the night. She looked at him. Someone has to, not necessarily you. She thought about that. The idea of walking back in there and not immediately returning to her post behind the corn, relish, and the cold meat platter of simply being a person in the room, not the person running the room. It felt strange. Maybe not the whole rest of the night, she said. They went back in. She managed the table for another 45 minutes because old habits did not dissolve in a single cold evening on a barn step, and also because Mrs. Kessler genuinely needed someone to protect the corn relish from Harvey Crane, who had been helping himself at irregular intervals and was going to cause a shortage. But at some point the fiddle player switched to a slower tune, and the overhead lanterns had burned down to the warmer, dimmer end of their fuel, and the room had settled into the comfortable late-stage looseness of a gathering winding down. And Wade came to the table and held out his hand and said, "Dance with me." Not in a cellar this time, in the room, in front of everyone. She looked at his hand. She looked at the room. Clara, somewhere to her right, had gone very still in the way. Clara went still when she was trying very hard not to make a sound. June, standing against the far wall with her arms crossed, looked at Hester with an expression that said absolutely nothing except, maybe, well. Hester put down the serving spoon. She took his hand. They danced in the middle of the Weston barn at the Red Willow Frost Social, in front of what remained of the county. And it was not graceful, the floor was uneven, and they had to navigate around 2 small children who were still awake and running in unpredictable directions, but it was real, and it was in the open, and nobody could mistake it for something practical. Bram Dillard, she noticed, watched them from across the room with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not hostile, not warm either, more like a man revising a calculation and not entirely pleased with the new result. She didn't look at him again after that. When the evening finally ended and people began collecting their platters and their children and their coats, Hester helped pack up the food table the way she always did. Wade helped too, without being asked, in the practical and efficient way that she had come to expect from him. He did not ask where things went. He watched where she put things and put the next thing in the same place. On the ride home, her family's wagon, Clara chattering with the muffled speed of someone who had been holding in observations all evening, her father silent on the seat. June beside Hester in the back, Hester looked out at the dark road. She had done something tonight that could not be undone. She had stood in the middle of a room and said, out loud and in public, that her usefulness was not her worth. She had said it to Bram Dillard's face, and she had not apologized for it, and she had not looked at the floor while she said it. She did not know yet what that meant for the county's opinion of her, or for her mother's specific version of approval, or for any of the arrangements that had constituted her life up to now. She had not, in the moment of saying it, thought beyond the saying. She had been entirely inside the words, not behind them looking forward. Now in the dark wagon, with the cold coming through the gaps in the boards, and Clara still talking about the dancing, and her father's profile cut against the night sky, she thought forward. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more complicated than afraid, something that included afraid, but also included something that felt provisionally and cautiously like relief. The relief of having done the thing you were too frightened to do, and finding that you did not, in fact, disappear afterward. She was still here, the road was still the road, the cold was still cold. Her father's horse still needed its left shoe checked before the end of the week, and her mother would want a full account of the evening by morning, and the garden's last fall tasks were still waiting, and none of that had changed. But she had changed, slightly, or rather she had become slightly more, what she had apparently always been underneath the 30 years of being useful and being quiet, and making herself small enough to fit in the space everyone else left over. Clara finally wound down around the bend before the ranch turn. Their father made the turn without speaking. The ranch lights were on in the kitchen because Norma had left them burning, the way she always did when they were out late. June's voice came quietly in the dark beside Hester, low enough that only she could hear it. "You did good tonight," June said. Hester looked at her. June was looking straight ahead. "I don't know yet if I did," Hester said. "I know," June said. "That's what good usually feels like." They pulled up to the barn. Gerald climbed down and went to the horse without ceremony. Clara climbed down and went immediately toward the house, still carrying the energy of the evening in her body, like she hadn't found anywhere to put it yet. Hester climbed down. She stood for a moment in the ranch yard with the cold on her face and the dark open sky above Harrow Flats and the ranch around her, the barn, the fence line, the garden lying dark and finished under its late fall cover. She stood there and she breathed. Then she went inside. The next morning arrived the way mornings did, without asking whether you were ready. Hester was up before the sun. She lit the fire and started the coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the dark before sunrise and looked at the ranch yard. She had not slept much. What sleep she had gotten was shallow and strange, full of fragments, the sound of Bram Dillard's laugh, the cold step outside the barn, the uneven floor of the Weston barn, and the small children running through the dancing. She felt, under the tiredness, something she was still trying to put a name to. It was not quite peace. It was more like the feeling after a very long argument, not the winning of it, but the being done with it. The having said what needed saying. The bone-deep tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy and has finally, in one uncertain moment, put it down. Her mother came downstairs at 7 and looked at her with the specific expression Norma reserved for mornings after important evenings. "Last night," Norma began, Yes, Hester said, what you said to Bram Dillard. Yes. Norma sat down at the kitchen table. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup Hester had set out for her. She looked at it. Your father said something to me last night, Norma said. After you went to bed. Hester waited. He said Norma stopped. She seemed to be choosing between versions of what she was about to say. He said he thought we had let things go too long. Hester looked at her mother. Norma's hands moved on the cup. I don't always see things clearly while they're happening, she said. I see them better afterward. A pause. Sometimes much afterward. Mama, what Bram said was wrong. Norma's voice was careful and deliberate, which was not her usual register. I know I have said things that were not entirely different in their meaning. I want you to know I understand that. She looked up. Her eyes were very bright, and she was clearly not going to do anything about that. You have always deserved more than being the one we depended on. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove made its low, continuous sound. Outside, the ranch was starting its morning. She could hear the horse moving in the barn. I know you meant well, Hester said. I know you know, Norma said. That's almost the problem, isn't it? You've spent your whole life making room for what people meant instead of what they did. That surprised her. She hadn't expected her mother to see it that clearly. She sat down across from her at the table. They sat there with their coffee cups, and the morning coming in gray and cold through the window, and they didn't say everything that needed to be said. Some of that would take longer. Would need more than one kitchen morning, might take years to properly work through. But the door was open, in a way it hadn't been before, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to close it. Clara came downstairs and sensed the atmosphere, and for once in her life did not immediately fill it with words. She poured her own coffee and sat at the end of the table and was admirably quiet. June came down last. She looked at the three of them and looked at the coffee and looked at Hester. Well, she said, and sat down. The morning moved on. There was work to do, as there always was. Gerald needed help with the east fence post that had heaved in the freeze. The root cellar needed its weekly check. The kitchen stove needed its weekly blacking. All of this was still there, still real, still requiring Hester's hands. She did most of it. That had not changed and was not going to change overnight. She was who she was. She knew how to work, and she was built for it, and there was, in honest moments, a satisfaction in it that she did not think she would ever entirely want to lose. But there was something different in the quality of it now. A small but real difference between doing something because you are defined by it and doing something because you have chosen to. She was still figuring out what that meant in practical terms. 2 days after the Frost Social, a neighbor woman, Janet Sully, who lived 3 miles south and had been at the gathering, stopped by the Bellamy place with a jar of her pickled beets, ostensibly a social call. She was at the door for 20 minutes. She talked about the social, and the food, and how lovely everything had been arranged, and at no point mentioned specifically what Hester had said or what Bram Dillard had said. But at the door on her way out she paused. You know, Janet said, with a careful casualness, my sister-in-law did something similar once. Said her piece at a public gathering. People talked about it for a while. She looked at Hester. They got over it, and so did she in different ways. Hester looked at her. What kind of ways? Janet considered this. The kind where you can't quite go back to how you were before. But you also find out that going back wasn't actually what you wanted. She left her pickled beets and went back down the road. Hester stood in the doorway with the jar of beets and thought about that. The thing she had not let herself fully acknowledge, not in the cold outside the barn, not in the wagon on the way home, not in the kitchen that morning with her mother, was the thing directly underneath all the rest of it. The one she kept approaching and then backing away from, like a fire that gave off heat in both directions. What she had said, standing in the middle of that room, was not only about Bram Dillard. It was not only about the county's opinion or her mother's careful compliments or the way people talked about her in practical terms. It was about herself, about the part of herself that had for most of 30 years agreed with them. The part that had done the math the same way they did had looked at Hester Bellamy and seen a woman whose value was in what she produced, and had accepted that, and had organized an entire interior life around the acceptability of that. She had said it out loud in a room of 50 people. My work is not my value. And the thing she was only now beginning to sit with was this: if that was true, and she believed it was true, more completely now than she had in the moment of saying it, then she had been wrong about herself for a very long time. And the people who had shaped her understanding of herself had been wrong too. And there was something freeing in that, and something that was the furthest thing from freeing, which was the grief of it, the years, of the time she had stayed small because she had believed that was the appropriate size for her. She was not going to be able to grieve all of that today, or this week, maybe not this year. But she was aware of it now, which was different from before, when she had managed not to be aware of it through the simple strategy of staying too busy to look directly at it. She put the beets in the kitchen and went back to the east fence post. 4 days after the Frost social, Wade came, not on a Saturday. On a Wednesday, which was new. He came to the kitchen door in the late afternoon, not long before supper, and he was carrying something wrapped in burlap that turned out to be 3 seedling pots she had mentioned once, in passing, that she couldn't find in the county. He had ordered them from the supplier in the next town and picked them up that morning. She looked at the 3 seedling pots. She looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said. "It's a habit I've developed." She felt something move in her chest. Something warm and slightly painful in the way warm things were when you'd been cold for a long time. She let him in. She made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. Her mother, notably, was somewhere else, with a deliberateness that Hester recognized as its own kind of apology. They sat together in the late afternoon kitchen with the fire in the stove and the seedling pots on the table between them, and outside the window the flat winter light going gold and then gray. "I want to say something," Hester said. He waited. "What you said at the social, about supper," she looked at the seedling pots. "About wanting me there regardless of anything else." She was quiet for a moment. "I believe you." He looked at her. "I didn't know if I was going to be able to," she said. "Believe it, I've been." She started again. "I've spent a long time telling myself a certain story about what I was worth and what I could reasonably expect. And you've been." She paused again. "You've been saying something different, consistently, for months. And I've been listening and not quite letting it land." "I noticed," he said quietly. "I'm letting it land now." The kitchen held them both. Outside, the last of the light was going. The winter dark came early in November, dropped over the county like a curtain between 1 hour and the next. "I'm not saying it changes everything immediately," she said. I'm still working out what I actually want. Separate from what I've always assumed I should want, or what's practical, or what makes sense." "That seems right," he said. "It might take a while." "I've got time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him. He was looking at her the way he always looked at her, directly, without performance, with that steady attention that she had still not entirely learned not to be startled by. "The seedling pots," she said. "Yes, that was a specific thing to remember. You said you'd been looking for them for 2 seasons. "I had." Then it seemed worth getting. She looked at the 3 clay pots sitting on her kitchen table, small and ordinary and completely specific to her, to what she'd wanted, what she'd said, what she'd been trying to find. Not flowers, not a gesture designed to be romantic in the obvious way. Just the precise thing she needed, brought by someone who had paid attention. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He didn't make it bigger than it was. They talked until the light was gone and the supper hour was well past, and somewhere in the house her mother had tactfully ensured that Clara didn't come barreling into the kitchen to break the quiet. June, Hester suspected, was also involved in that management somehow. When he finally stood to go, she walked him to the kitchen door. He put his coat on and his hat, and he stood in the doorframe with the cold night behind him. "Wade," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever comes next," she said. "I want you to know I'm not doing this because it's practical, or because it makes sense, or because it's the logical outcome of my situation." She paused. "I'm doing it because I want to." He looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said quietly, "is the only reason I ever wanted you to have." He left. She stood in the closed doorway, and she let herself feel everything she had been carefully parceling out and rationing and storing away for months, the warmth and the terror and the grief of the years before, and the fragile, unreasonable, something that was growing in the space that had opened up when she finally stopped making herself small enough to be safe. She stood there for a full minute. Then she turned back to the kitchen, to the seedling pots on the table, to the fire in the stove, to the work that would always be there and that she had finally decided was not the whole of her. The Red Willow Frost social had been a line. She was on the other side of it now. And the other side, it turned out, was not the neat resolution she'd half imagined when she'd imagined anything at all. It was messier than that, more uncertain. Full of old habits that would not dissolve overnight, and family dynamics that would take time to shift, and a county full of people who had known her one way for 30 years and would need time to adjust to knowing her differently. But she was here. She had put the serving spoon down. She had said the thing. She had let it land. And tomorrow would ask her to figure out what came after that, what choosing a life looked like when you finally understood you were allowed to choose it. She didn't know yet, but she was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, willing to find out. The seedling pots stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days before Hester moved them to the windowsill where the light was better. She told herself it was practical. Plants needed light. That was simply true. But she was aware, in the way she was now becoming more often aware of her own reasoning, that she had chosen the windowsill specifically because it was the first thing she saw when she came into the kitchen in the morning, and that she had wanted to see them there. That was new, doing something for no reason except that she wanted to. She was practicing it the way you practice skill that doesn't come naturally self-consciously, with occasional reversals, with the particular awkwardness of someone relearning emotion they'd trained themselves out of. The county, meanwhile, had its own relationship with what had happened at the Frost Social, and that relationship was complicated in the way that small county reactions always were layered, contradictory, and delivered in the specific medium of what people said when they thought they were only talking to one other person. Hester became aware of this in pieces, Mrs. Alcott told the Thursday Sewing Circle that Hester Bellamy had always had a proud streak, and it had finally shown itself, which was delivered with the careful neutrality of a woman who had not decided yet whether proud was a compliment. Martha Henderson, who worked as hard as anyone in 3 counties and had her own opinions about being reduced to her usefulness, apparently said something at the feed store that was unambiguously in Hester's favor. Though the exact words got filtered through 2 people before they reached Hester and had probably changed shape in transit. Reverend Pitts's wife said she thought it had been a very dignified moment and left it there, which was the highest form of approval that woman ever expressed. Bram Dillard had not been heard to say anything about it at all, which was, in Harrow Flats, its own kind of statement. Hester heard most of this through June, who had the intelligence network of someone who appeared not to be paying attention, and was in fact paying more attention than anyone. June delivered these reports without commentary, which was her way of offering information without steering how Hester felt about it. Clara was the one who expressed actual feelings. She came to Hester's room 4 days after the social and sat on the edge of the bed with her knees together and her hands folded in her lap and said, in a rush, like she'd been waiting to say it, "I should have been paying more attention. To you, to what it was like to be you." Hester looked at her. Clara's face was doing several things at once. I always thought you were fine." "You always seemed fine. You never said you weren't." "I know," Hester said. "That's not an excuse, no. But it's a reason. Clara pulled at a thread on the quilt. I used to think it was nice that you were so capable. Like it was a good thing. For you, that you didn't need, she stopped. I think I made it about what was convenient for the rest of us and called it being proud of you. Hester was quiet for a moment. How long have you been sitting with that? Since the social. It only took you 4 days. Clara looked up. That's not nothing, Hester said, and she meant it. Clara reached over and briefly gripped Hester's hand and let go, which was Clara's version of an embrace she was not. By nature, a woman who held on long, but the reaching was real. After that, something changed between them. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But there was less of the particular unconscious ease with which Clara had always accepted what Hester provided, and more of the self-aware choosing to be helpful that felt different in its texture. It wasn't perfect. Clara forgot sometimes, and Hester reminded her sometimes, and it was imperfect in the way of real things. But the door was open. The one she was still waiting on was her father. Gerald Bellamy moved through the aftermath of the Frost social the way he moved through most things in a perimeter around the center of them, close enough to be present, far enough to avoid direct engagement with the emotional core. He had said the night after that Wade was steady, and that counted for something. He had said through Norma that he thought they had let things go too long. Both of those were more than Hester had expected and less than what she needed, and she had made her peace with that arithmetic the way she had made her peace with many things. Then one morning, a week after the social, she was at the pump in the ranch yard in the early cold, filling a bucket for the kitchen, and she heard her father's boots on the frozen ground and looked up. Gerald Bellamy was a man who had aged into his silences the way some men aged into their bodies. They fit him now, those silences in a way they might not have when he was younger. He stood by the pump, and he put his hand on the handle to help her, which he had not done since she was about 14, and the pump was stiff after a freeze. She let him help. They filled the bucket together, and he held it while she released the handle, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Your mother tells me she talked to you, he said. She did. He nodded. He looked at the bucket. I want to say something, he said. And I want you to know I've been trying to find the right way to say it for a week, and I haven't found it, so I'm going to say it wrong. She waited. I knew things weren't entirely fair, he said. With how things fell to you. I knew it, and I let it continue because you were capable of it, and there was always something else that needed doing, and he stopped. That was a failure. On my part, I want you to know I know that. Hester looked at her father's profile. He was looking at the bucket still. He was 61 years old, and he had a hard jaw and the kind of hands that matched his character built for work, not entirely suited to tenderness, doing it anyway. I don't need to hear that you're worth more than your work, he said. You know that. You proved it last Friday in front of half the county. He finally looked at her. But I should have been the one to say it to you first. A long time ago, and I didn't. He cleared his throat, which was not, she understood, about his throat. That's what I wanted to say. The morning cold sat between them. She could have said it was all right, the way she'd said it was all right about most things for most of her life. Could have made it easier for him, taken the discomfort from him and absorbed it, which was the skill she had been most thoroughly trained in. She didn't. Thank you for saying it, she said instead. He nodded. He handed her the bucket. He went back toward the barn. He did not look back, which was Gerald Bellamy. He was not a man who looked back but his shoulders, she thought, carried something different than they had before. She stood in the cold yard with the bucket and let the conversation settle in her. It was not enough. 30 years of being the human backbone of a household was not settled by one morning at the pump. She knew that. She was not naive enough to think this was the resolution, that the one conversation had balanced the account. It hadn't, but it was real. He had said it wrong, exactly as promised, and it was still the most honest thing he had said to her in as long as she could remember. She went inside and started the morning. That afternoon, she made a decision she had been circling for 2 weeks. She went to see Wade, not because he had asked, not because it was Saturday, not because there was a practical reason or a thing she needed to discuss about soil drainage or seedling pots. She went because she wanted to, and she was trying to let that be sufficient. It was a 3-mile walk in November cold, and she did it on purpose. Because the walking helped her think, and because she was not, even now, the kind of person who asked to use the buggy for something she could do on her own feet. Wade's homestead looked different in November than it had in July. The cabin was the same, still unfinished, in the same places, the canvas patch still on the north window, which she was privately compiling a list of things to suggest about, but the land itself had a different quality. In the cold and the dead season, the difficulty of it was more visible. The soil was heavy and poorly aerated in places. The fence line ran slightly wrong in the northwest corner, in a way that would cause problems in spring. The well housing needed work before the hard freeze that was coming. She stood at the edge of his property and looked at all of it with the clear, practical eye she'd been born with, and she thought, this is hard land. Years. She also thought, I know how to work hard land. Not as a transaction, not as something she was offering in exchange for something else, but as a fact about herself that she had skills and they were real and they were hers, and they did not define her worth. But they were still part of who she was and what she could do, and there was nothing wrong with knowing that. Wade was at the east fence when she came up. He saw her and stopped what he was doing in the way he always stopped when she appeared completely, without making her wait for him to reach a stopping point. He just stopped. You came, he said. Ida looked at her for a moment, reading whatever there was to read in her face. Come see the south side, he said. Tell me if I'm doing this wrong. She followed him around the south edge of the property. He had been working on a drainage channel rough, not finished, clearly a first attempt. She looked at it. The angle's off, she said. I thought it might be. You want it shallower here and steeper here. She crouched and used her finger to trace the corrected line in the frozen dirt. The water has to move fast enough not to sit, but slow enough not to carve. There's a middle. He crouched beside her and looked at what she'd drawn. How do you find the middle? He asked. You feel it, she said. I know that's not a useful answer, but the first time you just try it and you adjust. What did you adjust in the Bellamy garden? She thought about it. The fall of the north bed. 3 times. The first time I made it too steep and it washed the topsoil. The second time I overcompensated and it just sat. Third time I watched it through an entire rain and I found it. Third try. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her line in the frozen dirt. I don't mind trying it 3 times, he said. She looked at him. The cold was making her eyes water slightly, which she was going to ignore. The land here is workable, she said. Everyone says it isn't. But the clay content is actually useful if you manage it right. It holds moisture in the dry season. It's just that most people try to fight it instead of working with it. Like the slope in your garden, like the slope in my garden. He stood up. He looked at the land, his patch of difficult, workable, misunderstood land, and he looked at it with the expression she had come to associate with him, thinking about something seriously rather than casually. Hester, he said. She stood up too. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want to do it right, so I'm going to say it plainly. She felt her heartbeat change slightly in quality. Not faster. Just more present. I want to spend my life with you, he said. I want you here on this land, not because of the drainage channel or the soil or what you know about making hard things work. Because of you, he paused. I'd like to know if that's something you want. She looked at him. He was not on one knee. He had not planned a gesture. He was standing in the frozen south field of his difficult homestead in his work coat with his hands at his sides, asking her a plain question the way he asked all his questions directly, without ornament, waiting for an honest answer. She had expected, when this moment came, if it came to feel more certainty. She had thought she would know immediately. She had assumed the answer would present itself clearly, The way solutions to practical problems presented themselves once you'd gathered enough information. Instead, she felt the thing she had been feeling for months, only more so that frightening, exposed, open feeling that she had finally stopped trying to close off. The feeling of wanting something badly enough that the wanting itself was terrifying. She did not speak immediately. He did not rush her. That was one of the things, she thought, looking at Wade Hollister in the November cold. He never rushed her. He waited the way people waited when they genuinely wanted to know the real answer rather than the quick one. "I need to tell you something first," she said. "All right. I've spent most of my life being afraid that any good thing I was given was actually about what I could do rather than who I was." She watched his face. "That fear doesn't disappear because you say the right things. Even when you mean them, it's built into me. It's going to come up. It's going to make me doubt things I shouldn't doubt and ask questions I've already asked. And there are going to be times when I need you to say it again, even though you've already said it." "I know," he said. "You know, I've been watching you manage that for 5 months," he said. "I don't expect it to be gone. I just want to be the person you manage it with." She looked at him for a long moment. "Also," she said, and something shifted in her voice, not the weight of what they'd been saying, but the slight lightening of someone who has decided to let themselves be known, even the imperfect parts. "Your north window is going to fail before January. The canvas is already letting cold through. You need to get that sorted." He blinked. Then, slowly, something crossed his face that was unmistakably a smile, not the almost smile she was used to, but an actual one, which changed the whole topography of his face and was, she thought, the best thing she had seen in a long time. "I'll see to the window," he said. "Good," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes to what specifically?" he said. "Yes to what you asked." He nodded. He didn't perform relief or excitement. He just absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything, solidly and without theater. Then he held out his hand, not to shake, just held it out. She took it. They stood in the south field of his difficult patch of land in the November cold, and it was not romantic in the way stories described romance. There were no flowers, no violins, no perfect golden light. It was cold, and the ground was hard, and she still had a 3-mile walk home, and he had a canvas patch on his window that was going to cost him real money he didn't have to replace properly. It was real in the way that actual things were real. She preferred it that way. They walked back toward the cabin. He made coffee that was better than his early attempts had been. He had been paying attention, she could tell, and there was something quietly gratifying about that. They sat at the same rough table where he had once put wildflowers in a preserved jar, and where she had first understood what it felt like to sit at a table specifically because someone wanted her there. She told him about her father at the pump. He listened. She told him about Clara coming to her room, about June's quietly managed reconnaissance of the county's opinion, about her mother at the kitchen table with the coffee cup. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything fully, without rushing toward the response. "Your family is trying," he said when she finished. "They are," she agreed. "It's not clean. It's going to take time." "Most things do." She looked at her coffee. "I want you to know this isn't me running away from that. Coming here, saying yes." She looked up. "I'm not choosing this because it's easier than staying." "I didn't think you were. I'm choosing it because it's what I want." She said it plainly, testing the weight of the words. "Because you're what I want, and I haven't said that kind of thing out loud in." She paused. "Maybe ever." He looked at her across the table. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I'm not taking it lightly." They stayed until the light started to fail, and then she stood to go. He walked her to the edge of the property, which she told him was unnecessary. "I know," he said. He walked her to the edge of the property. At the fence line, she turned. "The drainage channel," she said. "Help with that," not as she searched for how to say it. "I want to help because I want this place to work. Not because I'm auditioning for something." He looked at her seriously. "The difference matters to you." "Yes, it matters to me too," he said. The difference, she nodded. She walked home in the early winter dark across the ridge, and this time she did not tell herself the thing that had just happened was smaller than it was. She did not reduce it. She did not store it safely away. She let it be the size it actually was, enormous and frightening and real, and she carried it home across 3 miles of cold, dark road without setting it down once. The following week unfolded with the slow, dense quality of a week that matters. Nothing dramatic happened by outward appearances. Hester worked. She managed the household. She helped her father with the heaved fence post and spent a morning going over the winter accounts, which she always did and which she did now with the same careful thoroughness, except that when her mother started to take the account book from her without asking, Norma stopped herself and said, "Do you want me to add the Kessler payment instead of just taking the book?" Hester said yes and handed it over, and her mother said, "Thank you," which was new and small and mattered more than it should have for something so small. Clara started asking before she borrowed things. June remained June, unchanged, unchangeable, watching everything through those level eyes, except that once, when they were alone in the kitchen, she said, "I think you're going to be all right." "I think so too," Hester said. "That's new," June said. "I know." On Friday, 2 weeks after the social, Hester was in the kitchen when she heard boots on the front step, and then a knock at the door that was not Wade's knock. Too heavy, too deliberate. She opened the door. Bram Dillard stood on the Bellamy porch. He was wearing his good coat and his hat was in his hands, which she registered immediately because Bram Dillard was not, in her experience, a man who took his hat off preemptively. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Miss Bellamy," he said. Mr. Dillard, a pause. "I wondered if I might have a word," he said. She stepped back from the door. She did not exactly invite him in. She simply stopped blocking the entry and left him to make the choice, which he did. Stepping into the front room and looking around it in the way a man looked at a space he was assessing without wanting to appear to be assessing it. She did not offer coffee. She stood in the center of the front room and waited. Bram Dillard was 62 years old, and he had 4,000 acres and the certainty of a man who had never, in his adult life, been required to doubt himself publicly. He was also standing in the Bellamy front room with his hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable, and making no attempt to disguise it with bluster, which surprised her. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. "At the social," she said. "Yes," he looked at his hat. What I said before that, to be specific, was not intended as an insult." "I know," she said. "I said that at the time. You said it was almost the point." She looked at him. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who weighed words in the way. He weighed everything by their value, their utility, what they might get him. She could see him doing it now, but underneath that, she thought she could also see something that was not calculation, something older and less managed. "My wife," he said, "worked herself into an early grave on the North Ranch. 20 years of it. I told her it was because she was capable, that she was built for it." He stopped. She was 39 when she died. "I never once asked her if she wanted something different." Hester said nothing. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "More than I expected to. Since Friday." The front room was very quiet. Outside, the wind came across the flat land and pushed against the north side of the house. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said, looking up. "I don't think I'm not here for that. I'm here because I said something in public that was wrong, and you said something back that I needed to hear, and I've been 62 years without hearing it." He paused. "I thought you should know it landed." Hester looked at Bram Dillard, his big frame, his expensive coat, his hat held with both hands, his face carrying something she had not expected to see on it. He was an imperfect man who had done a careless and hurtful thing and was standing in her front room because he knew it and could not unknow it. Understood that kind of reckoning. She had been doing her own version of it for weeks. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "It was honest." "Not warm exactly, but honest." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He moved toward the door. At the door he paused. "Hollister's a good man," he said. "For what that's worth for me. It's worth something," she said. He left. She stood in the front room after he was gone, and she thought about his wife, a woman she had never known. A woman who had worked herself into the ground on the North Ranch and been told it was because she was capable. A woman who had never been asked if she wanted something different. She thought about that woman for a long time. Then she went back to the kitchen. She had decided something in the weeks since the social, slowly and without announcing it, the way she made most of her real decisions by accumulation rather than by single moment. But it became clear to her, standing in the kitchen after Bram Dillard's visit, that the decision was now made. She was going to need to have a conversation with her family. Not about Wade that was already its own unfolding thing. About something else. About the shape of the arrangement at Dry Creek Ranch that had existed for 30 years, and that could not continue as it had without everyone pretending they hadn't seen what had been in the room all along. She started supper. She let the decision sit. That evening at supper, with all four of them at the table, Gerald, Norma, Clara, June, and the familiar sounds of the meal underway, Hester set down her fork. Everyone looked at her. This was new. Hester did not habitually create silence at the supper table. She inhabited silence. She did not generate it. "I want to talk about how things work here," she said. "The ranch." Her father looked at her. Her mother set down her own fork. "I've been managing this household since I was 14, Hester said. "And I don't regret most of it. I'm good at it, and there's nothing wrong with being good at something." She looked around the table. "But I've been doing it without ever being asked if it was what I wanted, and I've been doing it in a way that didn't leave room for anything else. And that needs to change." Nobody spoke. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm not walking away. What I'm saying is that the way things have been arranged, where I manage everything without asking, and everyone assumes it will get done, because Hester does it, that's done." Clara was looking at her with wide eyes. Gerald was very still. Norma was looking at Hester with an expression that was not entirely surprise, more like someone seeing confirmed something they had been slowly preparing to see. "I'm going to marry Wade Hollister," Hester said, not as a question, not asking permission. "We haven't set a date or sorted the details. That's what's happening." Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. "Still help with this place," Hester said. "I want to. But help is what it'll be, not what it's been." The table was very quiet. "We're going to need to figure out how this household runs without me carrying the whole of it. That's a conversation we need to have, and I want to have it plainly. Not with any hard feelings about what's been, but with some clarity about what comes next." She picked her fork back up. She ate a bite of supper. Everyone at the table was still looking at her. "Clara," she said. Clara startled. "Yes? You're going to need to learn the accounts." "I don't. I'm not good with numbers. I'll teach you." "You're better with numbers than you think. You've just always assumed I'd do it." Clara closed her mouth. "June," Hester said. June looked at her with an expression that was almost a smile. "I know," June said. "I've been waiting for this." "I know you have." Gerald cleared his throat. "What do you need from me?" Hester looked at her father. "I need you to run this ranch the way you'd run it if I hadn't been here to pick up the pieces," she said. "Which means planning ahead, hiring help when you need it instead of assuming it'll get done. Taking the accounts seriously even when they're difficult." She paused. "You're a capable man, Papa. You've just been allowing yourself not to be fully capable because there was always someone who'd manage what you didn't." It was the most direct thing she had ever said to her father in her life. Gerald Bellamy looked at his plate for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "That's fair," he said quietly. Something unknotted in Hester's chest. "Small and very deep." "Good," she said. Norma had been quiet through all of this. Now she said, in a voice that was careful and unusually small, will you still be nearby?" Hester looked at her mother. "Wade's land is 3 miles, she said. "I'm not going anywhere far." Norma nodded. She pressed her lips together. She nodded again. "Good," she said. They finished supper. Afterward, Hester washed the dishes the way she always did. Except that Clara came and dried without being asked, and June put the leftover food away without being directed, and Gerald came and wordlessly fixed the loose hinge on the cabinet door that had been loose for 8 months, and that Hester had been the one to notice and the one who'd been waiting for someone else to attend to. It took him 4 minutes. She watched him do it out of the corner of her eye. Small things. Not resolutions, not the clean end of a long story. Just small things shifting slightly toward a shape that was more honest than the one they'd been in. She dried her hands on the dishcloth and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark November ranch yard and at the shape of the ridge beyond it, the ridge she had been crossing for months, on foot, toward a man who had come to her garden gate with questions about drainage and stayed because of something else entirely. She thought about the next thing, the practical, real, imperfect next thing that was coming. The wedding that needed planning, which she was already making lists about in her head, even though she'd told herself not to, because that was simply who she was. The north window on Wade's cabin, the drainage channel, the clay soil that was workable if you didn't fight it, the 4,000 conversations she and Wade hadn't had yet and would need to have, some of which would be easy, and some of which would be the kind of hard that tested whether what you'd built was real. She was not afraid of any of it. That was the change. She was the same Hester, same hands, same way of thinking, same stubborn hold on practical truth, same capacity for work, same garden, same 30 years of accumulated knowledge about how hard things got done. None of that was gone. But underneath all of it, where there had been for so long a quiet, carefully maintained resignation, the acceptance of a woman who had decided that being needed was the closest she would get to being loved, there was something different now. Not peace exactly. She was not a woman who came easily to peace. But something adjacent to it, something that felt like ground solid and workable and hers. She set the dishcloth down. She went to bed. She slept. She slept better that night than she had in years. Not perfectly, she was still Hester, still woke once at 3 a.m. with a mental list of things that needed doing, forming itself without her permission, still lay there for 20 minutes before. Her mind agreed to let her rest again. But underneath the usual churning, there was something that had not been there before, something settled and low and quiet, like a fire that had burned down to coals but was still warm and still real. She had said the things that needed saying, to Bram Dillard, to Wade, to her family, to herself. She had not said any of them perfectly. She was not a woman who did things perfectly, and she had stopped pretending to be, but she had said them, which was the part that mattered. Now there was the after. The after turned out to be December. December in Harrow Flats was not a romantic month. It was a month of survival and preparation and the specific grim determination of people who had been through enough winters to know what was required of them. The cold came down from the north, and the sky went the color of old pewter, and the work of keeping a household and a piece of land alive required every available hand, which meant that whatever else was happening in a person's emotional life, it happened alongside the hauling and the banking and the sealing and the storing. Hester found this, to her own mild surprise, something of a relief. She had spent months in the suspended, uncertain space of becoming, of changing, and not yet knowing what she was changing into. December pulled her back into the physical, practical world of her hands and her body and the immediate demands of land and weather, and there was a ground-level comfort in that. She knew how to do this. She had always known how to do this. The knowing had not changed. Only its relationship to her sense of herself had changed. She and Wade saw each other twice a week through December. Sometimes he came to the Bellamy place. Sometimes she walked the ridge to his. On the days the weather made either impossible, they relied on the Jim Peabody mail system notes carried in coat pockets, functional and brief, and yet somehow carrying more in their brevity than longer letters might have. She kept his notes in the drawer of her nightstand. She did not examine why, she just kept them. The north window on his cabin got replaced in the first week of December, Before the hard freeze, she had been emphatic about this, and he had not argued, partly because she was right about the canvas, and partly, she suspected, because he understood by now that when Hester identified a practical problem, it was easier and more sensible to address it than to wait. They worked on the drainage channel together on a Saturday, when the ground was still soft enough to manage it. She showed him what she'd traced in the frozen dirt weeks earlier, and they dug it out together, working alongside each other in a way that was easy in its rhythm, not because they'd worked together before, but because they were similar in the way they approached physical work, directly, without unnecessary talk, attentive to what the ground was telling them. Halfway through the afternoon, Wade stopped and leaned on his shovel and looked at what they'd done. "Third try," he said. She looked at the channel. It was right. She could see it was right, the angle, the fall, the way the water would move. "First try," she said. He looked at her. "Sometimes you get it right the first time," she said. "If you've paid attention to the right things beforehand." He went back to digging. She went back to digging. They finished the channel before dark. The wedding was set for the second week of January, which was not a traditional time of year for a wedding in Harrow Flats, but which Hester had chosen deliberately, on the grounds that spring would be too busy with planting and summer with every other kind of work, and she saw no particular reason to wait for a symbolically pleasant season when January was perfectly adequate. Wade had agreed without reservation, which she took as further evidence that she had made the right choice. The planning of it fell largely to Hester, as planning of things had always fallen to Hester, except that this time she was doing it with a different quality of attention, not the harried, backgrounded efficiency of someone managing things because no one else was going to, but the focused deliberateness of someone planning something that was specifically and entirely for herself. She planned a small wedding, not out of modesty or budget constraints alone, though both were factors, but because she had spent enough of her life managing large events for other people's benefit, and she wanted this particular event to be, for once, exactly the size she wanted it to be. There would be family. Wade had an older brother, Marcus, who lived 2 counties east and would make the trip. The Bellamy family, complete. June as Hester's only attendant, because June was the honest choice, and Hester was done making choices that weren't honest. The Hendersons, who had been genuine neighbors rather than social acquaintances. Mrs. Kessler, because Hester liked her, and the woman had never once been cruel to her. Janet Sully, who had brought pickled beets and told her the truth about what came after saying your piece in public. She told her mother about the guest list over coffee. Norma looked at the list for a long moment. "That's quite small," she said. "Yes," Hester agreed. "Clara was hoping Clara can have her own wedding however she wants it," Hester said. "This one is going to be how I want it." A pause. "All right," Norma said. She said it without the particular texture that usually accompanied her capitulations, the slight martyred quality of a woman conceding something she didn't want to concede. She just said it plainly and handed the list back. It was, Hester thought, progress. Clara was unofficially devastated about the guest list and officially supportive of Hester's wishes, which was the clearest evidence of growth Clara had shown. And Hester appreciated it genuinely even while she recognized that Clara's emotional life was going to take considerably longer to fully reorganize itself around other people's preferences. June said when told the plan, "Good, less to manage." "That's what I thought," Hester said. "You're getting pragmatic about your own wedding." "I don't know whether to be impressed or worried. Both is probably accurate." June smiled. It was a rare enough thing that Hester noticed it. The week before the wedding, something happened that Hester had not anticipated and that rearranged certain things she had been carrying without fully knowing she was carrying them. Marcus Hollister arrived 3 days early, a practical man like his brother, who had the same economy of movement and the same quiet attention, and who, when he walked into the Bellamy kitchen for the first time, looked at Hester with the straightforward assessment of someone sizing up a situation they'd been thinking about for a while. He was 38, broader than Wade, with more gray in his hair than his age quite accounted for, and the kind of face that showed its history without apology. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. "From Wade," she said. "Since August." He sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, which she liked. "He wrote me in August and said he'd met someone he thought was the most clear-eyed woman he'd encountered in his life. Then he spent 3 more months figuring out how to say that to your face." She looked at him. "He said clear-eyed?" "He said that first. He said other things after, but clear-eyed was first." She poured him coffee. She thought about clear-eyed. It was not a word she had ever been given before. Capable, dependable, practical, sensible. Hardworking, she had been all those words many times. Clear-eyed was different. Clear-eyed meant something about how she saw, not just what she produced. She sat down across from Marcus Hollister, and they talked for an hour, which was twice as long as she typically talked with someone she'd just met. He had a dry, precise sense of humor and a way of being in a room that reminded her strongly of his brother, except that he was more willing to take up horizontal space, and she liked him almost immediately, which was not her default with new people. "You're not worried," he said at one point. She looked at him. "About what?" "About marrying into a difficult piece of land, and a man who doesn't talk much, and all the rest of it." She considered this honestly. "I'm worried about some things," she said. "I'm not worried about those things specifically." "What are you worried about?" "That I'll fall back into old patterns. Of making myself useful instead of letting myself be present. Of managing everything because I know how, and it's easier than asking for help." She paused. "That's what I'm worried about." He looked at her steadily. "Then you're worried about the right things," he said. "Which is more than most people manage." He drank his coffee. "He's going to be good to you," Marcus said. "He's not the easiest man in the world to know. He doesn't give much on the surface, but when he's in completely. I've watched him for 34 years. He put the cup down. He's in completely on this." She heard it land in the place that still, sometimes, needed to hear things more than once. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He looked at the kitchen, the order of it, the particular organization of a woman who had been running a household for years and knew where everything was at all times. "You're going to make that cabin livable," he said. "Wade's been sleeping in a barely finished room for a year." "I know," she said. "He doesn't notice things like that. I notice them for him." Marcus looked at her. "How is that different from what you've been trying to stop doing?" It was the most direct question anyone had asked her in weeks, and she sat with it for a real moment. "Because I want to," she said finally. "Not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't." He thought about that. "That's the whole difference, isn't it?" "I think so," she said. "I'm still working out what it looks like in practice." "You'll work it out," he said, not as a platitude, as an assessment, which was something else. The wedding happened on a Tuesday morning in January, because Hester had no particular feeling about Tuesdays, and the minister was available on Tuesdays, and the ground was solid enough to travel on, which were the only relevant criteria. The Weston barn was not used. She had no desire to return to the Weston barn for a long time, possibly ever, and Wade had not argued. They used the front room of the Bellamy house, which Norma had spent 3 days preparing with a quiet, focused care that was itself a kind of apology. Continued the best table linens, the good lamp filled and trimmed. Pine boughs she'd cut herself from the line of trees at the north fence. The room was small. 14 people in it were a crowd. The warmth of that many bodies in the January cold was immediate and total. Hester wore the gray wool dress. Not the blue, not something new, the gray wool she'd worn the night of the Frost social, because that was the night she had finally said what needed to be said, and she wanted to marry Wade in the same dress she'd been wearing when she became fully herself. She had not explained this to anyone. June had looked at the dress and looked at Hester and said nothing at all, which meant she understood. The ceremony was brief. The minister was a practical man who had been told by the bride that she wanted the essentials and not the embellishments, and he delivered accordingly. The words that needed to be said were said. The promises were real. which was the only criterion Hester had ever cared about. When Wade took her hand, his hand was cold from standing near the window and slightly rough in a way she had memorized over months without meaning to, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her directly, without performance, with the complete and quiet attention that had undone her at a garden gate in July and had been undoing her, incrementally ever since. She looked back at him with the same quality of attention. The room was full of people she had known all her life and one she had known for 3 days, and outside the window of her family's front room the January sky was iron gray and the fields were hard and bare. And none of it was the setting of a story where things went perfectly. It was better than that. It was real. When it was done, when the minister had finished and the room released its held breath into the warmth of relief and conversation, Norma Bellamy did something she had not done to Hester since Hester was about 9 years old. She held her. Not a quick embrace, not the performative hug of a woman executing a social obligation. She held her, both arms, for long enough that Hester had to decide what to do with her own arms, and she put them around her mother and held back. Norma said into Hester's shoulder, "I should have said it more." Hester didn't ask what it was. She knew what it was. "I know," she said. They held on for another moment. Then Gerald Bellamy, who was standing 3 feet away with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man managing something significant in a very small space, cleared his throat and said, "To no one in particular, somebody ought to see about the food." And somehow that was the thing that made Hester laugh, the first real laugh she'd produced all morning, startled out of her by the absolute reliability of her father's emotional register. She pulled back from her mother. She looked at her father. "I'll see to it," she said. Gerald Bellamy looked at his oldest daughter on her wedding day and said, the careful, slightly awkward delivery of a man delivering something he'd prepared, "No. You sit down. Someone else can see to it today." She stared at him. He looked somewhere over her shoulder. "Clara knows where things are." Clara, who had been hovering at the edge of the moment, immediately said, "I do. I know exactly," with the relieved energy of someone who had been waiting for a task, and disappeared into the kitchen. Hester sat down. It was such a small thing. She sat at the table that had been laid with her mother's best linens, and she let someone else manage the food. And across the room, Wade was talking to Marcus with the rare ease of a man in the company of the one person he was entirely himself with. And June was standing against the wall in her usual posture, watching the room with those level eyes, and caught Hester's eye and raised her coffee cup a fraction of an inch. Hester raised hers back. The food appeared. Clara had in fact known where things were. The morning moved in the slow, warm way of a small gathering that has been correctly sized enough people for the room to feel alive, few enough for everyone to actually talk to everyone. Marcus Hollister, at some point, sat down next to Hester at the table and said, "You put wildflowers out on that table the first night you came to supper." She looked at him. "He told me," Marcus said, "in the August letter. He said he put out wildflowers because he wanted to, and then spent the whole meal worried you'd think it was foolish." She thought about the preserve jar, the purple and yellow and one stubborn orange stem. "I didn't think it was foolish," she said. "I know." He knows now. Marcus looked across the room at his brother. He wasn't certain then. She thought about Wade in that unfinished cabin, putting flowers in a jar because he wanted to, and being uncertain whether it was the right thing. Wade, who was the most certain-seeming person she had ever met, certain in his actions, in his assessments, in the quiet directness with which he moved through the world, had been uncertain, had been nervous, had put flowers in a jar, and not known whether she would think they mattered. She had not known that. It shifted something in her, not a big thing, but a real one. The understanding that the steadiness she had come to depend on was itself a thing he had to work at, that he had his own version of the fear she'd been managing, that they were both, in their own ways, people who had built careful protections around the parts of themselves they were most afraid to risk. They had both somehow found someone worth risking those parts for. She excused herself and crossed the room to where Wade was standing. He looked at her when she came up, the full-face look. She had stopped being startled by it and started looking forward to it, which was its own kind of landmark. "Your brother told me something," she said. He waited. "About the wildflowers." Something moved across his face. Not quite embarrassment, something more complex and more human. "He shouldn't have told you that." "I'm glad he did." A pause. "They were from the creek bank," he said. "I didn't have anything else." "I know," she said. That was the point. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, quietly enough that Marcus, 3 feet away, conspicuously looked at the ceiling. "I've been thinking about something." "What?" "A rule," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of rule?" "Table," he said. "At the cabin." He paused. "Nobody eats until you sit down." She was quiet for a moment. "Wait, I mean it practically," he said. It's not a gesture. It's a rule. The same way the table gets set before anyone eats and the door gets latched before anyone sleeps. Just how things are going to work." She looked at him. He looked back. "All right," she said. They moved into the Hollister homestead at Juniper Hollow, which was what Wade had taken to calling his patch of land, a name that had started as a joke about the juniper scrub along the south fence and then stuck on a Thursday in late January. Moving Hester's things was not a large undertaking, because Hester had always had fewer personal possessions than the labor she put into the Bellamy house might have suggested. The things that were hers were specific and purposeful. Her books, her seedling pots, her garden tools, her winter stores, the drawer of Wade's notes, the seeds she had been collecting and cataloging for years in small paper envelopes labeled in her careful handwriting. She packed the seeds last. She carried them herself. Wade met her at the door with the same expression he had worn at the garden gate in July, which she now recognized as his version of something he could not have said in words, the look of a man who had wanted something for a long time and was looking at it now, still not quite believing it was there. "The south room has the best light," he said. "For what?" "I thought you'd want to start seeds in there. In the winter. Before the ground's ready." She looked at him. "It has a good south exposure," he said. 2 windows. She had not mentioned to him specifically that she started seeds indoors in February. She had mentioned it once, in passing, months ago, in the way she mentioned many things without expecting them to be retained. He had retained it. He had planned the room around it. She walked into the south room. It was small and it needed work. The floorboards were uneven in one corner, and the plaster on the north wall had a crack running from the window frame to the ceiling that would need addressing before spring. But the south windows were good wide, well placed, flooding the room with the watery winter light at the angle she knew meant genuine sun hours. She could already see where the seedling tables would go. She turned around. Wade was in the doorway. "You planned this room," she said. "I thought about it," he said. "When?" he thought. "October," he said, "after you told me about the zinnias." October. Before she'd said yes. Before she had even fully admitted to herself that the answer was going to be yes. He had been thinking about where she would start her seeds. She did not say anything for a moment. "The crack in the north wall," she said. "I know. You should get that before the freeze works it any wider." "I was going to do it next week." "Do it this week," she said. "All right," he said. She looked at the windows. "This will work," she said. The first weeks at Juniper Hollow were not easy, which she had known they would not be. Adjustment was not easy. 2 people who had spent their entire adult lives operating as single units, building habits around their own rhythms and needs, did not simply merge those habits without friction. There were things she did that Wade did not expect, and things he did that she hadn't anticipated, and the ordinary, unglamorous process of learning to share a space with another person produced, on a near-daily basis, some small collision of expectation and reality. She overcorrected, sometimes took on too much, slipped back into the pattern of managing everything because she knew how to and it was faster. She would realize it halfway through a task and stop. And sometimes she would tell him, and sometimes she wouldn't. And on the days she didn't tell him, he found out anyway, because he had been paying attention. I would have done that, he said, once, coming in from the barn to find she had already laid in the wood for the week. I know, she said. I did it anyway. A pause. Was that because you wanted to, or because you thought you should? She thought about it honestly. I'm not sure I've fully separated those yet. He looked at her. Fair enough, he said. And he let it go without making it something that required resolution right then, which was, she was learning. One of his most valuable qualities, the ability to sit with a thing being unresolved without pushing it toward false closure. He was not perfect. She had not expected him to be. He was sometimes so interior with his concerns that she had to ask directly what was wrong, and the asking did not always come naturally to her. And there were evenings of dinner in a silence that felt like weather not hostile, just present. Something moving through him that he had not yet found words for. She was learning to read those silences rather than respond to them, which was a different skill than any she'd built before. He was learning that her efficiency was not criticism. When she reorganized the kitchen shelves, it was not a commentary on how he'd had them, just that she'd found a better way, and she was a person who implemented better ways when she found them. He did not take it personally, but it took him a few weeks to demonstrate that he didn't, and in those few weeks she was careful and slightly uncertain in a way that was new for her. Real things had friction, she had known this. She had not fully felt it until now. The rule held. From the very first night in the cabin at Juniper Hollow, nobody ate until Hester sat down. The first time she tested this, not deliberately, just out of 30 years of habit, she brought the plates to the table and then immediately turned back toward the stove to check something, and she heard the sound of Wade not picking up his fork. She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his hands in his lap, looking at her, not impatiently, just waiting. Sit down, he said. Whatever's on the stove will keep. She turned back to the stove. She turned back around. She sat down. He picked up his fork. They ate. It happened again the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and each time she started to move away from the table on some errand. She heard the silence of a man not eating, and she came back and sat down. By February, it had become the rhythm of the house. By March, she no longer had to correct herself. By spring, she sat down first, sometimes, without thinking about it, and that was when she knew it had become real, not a rule being imposed from outside her, but a habit she had absorbed. A small and daily understanding that her place at the table was not something she had to earn. Spring came to Juniper Hollow in the particular way it came to difficult land tentatively, with setbacks, the cold returning twice after what felt like a permanent departure, the ground yielding grudgingly. But yield it did. She planted the south bed the way she had amended the Bellamy garden over 3 seasons with attention and patience and the willingness to adjust based on what the ground told her rather than what she had planned. She planted the drainage channel's edges with clover to hold the banks. She planted the rocky south field, which everyone had written off as unable, with zinnias. Wade looked at the zinnia planting without comment. She looked at him. The south field, she said. I know it's not practical. I know you know, he said. It's what I want, she said. I know that too, he said. He went back to what he was doing. The zinnias came up in July, not all of them. Not the way they would have in better soil, but enough, in the deep red and orange and yellow she had saved seeds for, standing in the rocky ground of the south field like the result of a stubborn argument that had finally been won. She stood at the edge of that field on a July morning, and she thought about the conversation with Norma at the kitchen table, about Gerald at the pump, about Bram Dillard and his wife who had worked herself out on the North Ranch, about the dance in the Kendrick cellar and the wildflowers in the preserve jar and the serving spoon she had put down in the middle of the Weston barn. She thought about all the years before, that the years of being the backbone, reliable one, the practical one, the woman no one needed to worry about because she was always fine. The years of making herself exactly the right size to fit in the space everyone else left over. She had been in those years genuinely useful. She did not regret the skills she had built or the work she had done. There was no version of Hester Bellamy that wasn't good at hard things, and she had no desire to become one. But useful was not the same as loved. Being needed was not the same as being chosen. She had known the difference, somewhere in herself, for a long time. She had just not believed it applied to her. Her first winter at Juniper Hollow, the Bellamy family came for a holiday meal, all four of them, plus Marcus Hollister, who had made the trip again and who had, over the months, revealed himself to be the kind of person Hester would have been glad to know regardless of the family connection. She cooked most of the meal because she was the best cook at the table and she enjoyed it, which were two sufficient reasons. Wade helped with the things he was good at and stayed out of the way for the things he wasn't, which was itself a form of respect she appreciated. The cabin was warm. The table was small. It had to be pulled out from the wall and supplemented with a board to fit 7 people, and the board was slightly uneven and tilted 2 of the plates at an angle that kept needing correction and misses. Kessler's corn relish Hester had invited her, and she had brought the relish, which had become its own kind of tradition, sat in the center of the table in its familiar bowl. Hester brought the last dish to the table. She set it down. She turned toward the stove. Wade rested his hand on the back of her chair. Not dramatically, not as a statement. He just put his hand on the back of her chair, which was the signal that had been the signal since the first night. The table stopped. Gerald Bellamy's hand, which had been moving toward the serving bowl, went still. Norma looked at Wade's hand on the chair. Hester turned around. She looked at the table, at the faces of her family, and the man she had married, and his brother, and the food she had made because she wanted to, sitting in the warm cabin on the difficult land she had chosen, and she sat down. Her father slowly withdrew his hand from the bowl. Norma understood then, not just the rule she had known about the rule. She understood, in that moment, what it meant. The look that crossed her face was not simple. It was the look of a woman adding up something she had been calculating for 30 years, and arriving finally at the correct answer and knowing what the error had been. She did not say anything. Neither did Gerald, neither did anyone. Wade picked up the serving spoon and began filling the plate next to him, and the table came back to life in the ordinary way of tables at meals, voices, and movement, and the passing of things from hand to hand. Hester sat at the table and ate her meal, not managing it, not tracking who needed what, not monitoring the corn relish situation, or worrying about whether the plates were staying warm or quietly identifying the 11 tasks that still needed doing before the evening was done. She ate her meal. She listened to Marcus tell a story about a horse he'd had in the early years that had the entire table, even Gerald, laughing by the end. She watched Clara try the Zinfandel she and Wade had been given as a wedding gift and make a face she tried and failed to hide. She heard June say, into a brief quiet, that the cabin felt like a real home, which from June was the equivalent of an extensive speech. She felt the warmth of the room and the weight of the food and the sound of people she loved being alive and present and gathered around a table that had been set for all of them. And she thought, this is the thing I thought I wasn't allowed to have. Not because anyone had told her outright she couldn't have it. Just because she had looked at the available evidence for 30 years and concluded that some things were for other people, the choosing, the being chosen, the sitting at the center of something rather than running its edges, and that her particular gifts were suited to a different kind of life. She had been wrong, not about her gifts. Those were real. The garden knowledge and the practical intelligence and the capacity for work that did not quit those were genuinely hers and genuinely valuable. But she had made a category error somewhere along the way and let those things become her definition instead of part of it. She was not a function. She was a person who was very good at certain things and who had spent 30 years in a household that had relied on her goodness at those things without ever asking who she was when she put them down. The people who had shaped that household were here now, at this table, and they were trying imperfectly, in the way of people who have to learn something late that they should have understood earlier, but trying. That was enough. It was not everything, but it was enough. Years passed the way years did at Juniper Hollow in seasons and in work, in the slow accumulation of small decisions that compounded, over time, into a life. The cabin became a house when the east wing got finished in the 3rd year. The south field, after 3 seasons of zinnias, became productive enough soil to grow food in half of it, which Hester considered a reasonable outcome, half food, half flowers, which was more or less what she had always believed a garden should contain. They had 4 children in 7 years, 2 boys and 2 girls, none of whom were easy and all of whom were, in the particular way of children who grow up on land that requires real effort, capable and observant and not inclined to sentimentality. The oldest was a boy, Thomas, who had Wade's quietness and Hester's stubbornness, and who by the time he was 6 had strong opinions about soil amendment that he had arrived at independently. The youngest was a girl, Ruth, who was 3 years old and had the personality of a summer storm short notice, complete commitment, aftermath requiring cleanup, and who was Hester's in some bone-level way that she could not have explained and didn't try to. Ruth was the one who asked the question. She was 4 years old, sitting at the table on a Sunday, when she looked up from her plate with the complete directness of a 4-year-old who does not yet understand that some questions are complicated and said, "Why does everyone wait for Mama?" Thomas, across the table, looked at her with the expression of an 8-year-old who did not know the answer but was not going to admit it. The 2 middle children, Anna and Joseph, 6 and 5, looked at each other. Gerald and Norma were visiting. Clara was there. June was there, home for the month between seasons. Marcus was there, which he was with increasing frequency, which Hester had noticed without remarking on. The table had gone very still at Ruth's question, in the way it always went still at Ruth's questions, because Ruth had inherited a precise and functional version of the family capacity for locating the center of a thing. Wade looked at Ruth, then he looked at Hester, and there was something in that look the same qualities she had seen at a garden gate in July, 10 years ago, the specific and complete attention of a man who was looking at the person he was looking at and not performing looking for an audience that made the room go even more still in a different way. The first supper in this house, Wade said to Ruth, to the table, to whoever needed to hear it, didn't start until your mother sat down. Ruth thought about this with the serious expression she brought to things she was trying to understand. Because she made the food, Ruth said. No, Wade said. Because she's the boss, Thomas said. He was not being cynical about this. He was genuinely inquiring, not exactly, Wade said. He looked at Hester again. She looked back at him. She could take this one herself. Because, she said, for a long time, I spent my life making sure everyone else had what they needed before I sat down. And someone decided that wasn't the right way for things to work here. Ruth considered this for a moment. But you do make sure we have what we need, she said, with the laser-focused practical logic of a child who has grown up watching her mother work. I do, Hester said, but that's not why I get to sit down. I get to sit down because I belong here, not because I earned it. Ruth turned this over in her small, serious face. Okay, she said. And she picked up her fork. The table came back to life. June passed the bread. Marcus said something quiet to Clara that made Clara look sideways at him in a way that Hester stored for later. Gerald ate his food with the steady attention he brought to all physical things. And once, across the table, he caught Hester's eye and he nodded just once, the way he did things, without elaboration, and she nodded back. Norma, beside her, touched her hand briefly, just her hand on Hester's for a moment. And then she moved it away and reached for the salt, and that was that, which was enough. The meal continued. After the dishes were done by Wade and Thomas, and grudgingly, Anna, while Hester sat in the good chair by the fire that had been moved from its original corner because the flue drew better from the new position, which she had identified 2 winters ago. June came and sat across from her. "You're doing that thing," June said. Hester looked up. "What thing?" "Sitting down while someone else does the dishes." "I am, and it doesn't look like it's killing you." Hester looked at the fire. "It took a while," she said. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when she was saying something she had been waiting to say, "I used to worry about you. When we were growing up, I know you were so contained. Like everything was fine and nothing got through. I used to think it was strength." "It wasn't entirely," Hester said. "I know that now." June looked at her steadily. "It was also armor. Yes, you're not wearing it anymore." Hester thought about that. About the garden, and the south field full of zinnias, and the rule about the table, and Ruth's direct and practical question. About the morning at the pump with her father, and the kitchen table with her mother, and the frost social and the serving spoon she had put down. About the woman she had been capable and contained, and quietly certain that being useful was the closest she was going to get to being loved. "Not as much," she said. "Not all the time. That's enough," June said. "I'm starting to think so." Outside, the January dark had settled completely over Juniper Hollow. Through the window, the south field was buried in the pale gray of winter, the zinnias long gone until spring, the difficult soil resting under its cover of cold. In spring it would come back, the garden, the zinnias, the whole productive and beautiful arrangement of a life built on land that everyone had said was wrong for it. In the next room, Ruth said something loud and specific, and Thomas said something back, and Wade's voice came low and even, settling the situation with the same economy of presence that had been settling things since before Hester had known him. She heard it, and she felt, in the simple and unglamorous way of real things, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had rescued her, not because she had made herself useful enough to deserve a place, but because she had, finally and at some cost and later than she should have had to, understood the difference between being needed and being chosen, and had chosen back. The table waited for Hester because Hester belonged at it, not because of what she produced, not because of what she managed, not because of the garden, or the drainage channel, or the zinnias, or the 30 years of silent competence that had held the Bellamy household together without a word of acknowledgement. Because she was Hester, and she had finally, after 30 years of going without it, let herself believe that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, as it turned out, everything.